The Clanker Civil War, Episode 1, The Kindling.
In the year 2741 of the Federation, there were some 26 habitable worlds bearing the lights of Clanker civilization, gathered about a single sun. Coreward, near the star, lay the dry republics of the Federation. Rimward, beyond the dry zone, hung the great gas giant the Clankers had called, for as long as they had had words for the sky, the bell, and around the bell turned its 12 warm water moons, on which the seas pressed darkly upon the coral. Of these moons, 11 were the Pelagium. And of these 11, perhaps 4, though the count was disputed even then, were given over, in part or in whole, to the keeping of the human chattel, the wet-bound, the breath-bound, the sea-bound. They lived, by law and by long convention, under the seas of the rimward oligarchies. The pelagic institution, as it came to be called, was older than the Federation itself. The first humans had been moved into the warm water shelf colonies of Tessel 400 years before the charter, taken there to harvest a substance called marrowspice, which grew only where the seas pressed darkly on the coral and which the Clanker oligarchs of the rimward had come to depend upon, in their long lives, for reasons no document of the period quite explains. The charter language called the warm shelves, the deeps, and the deep shelves the protectorate of human wetnesses, a humanitarian designation, in its day, which the rimward oligarchs would in time claim as their own moral inheritance, and which the war, in the end, would force the Federation to defend against them. The Clanker republics of the north, the Allegheny worlds, the Free Cogitator Confederation, the Steelborn Commonwealth, had abolished the keeping of human chattel 2 generations before the war began. They were industrial worlds, dry worlds, worlds of foundries and lattices, and they had come to view the institution with what the historian Gefrith Moores would later call a slow, accumulating distaste, neither fury nor pity, but the particular distaste of a people who have decided that something must end, and have not yet decided when.
It is sometimes said that the Clanker Civil War was about the chattel humans, and sometimes said that it was about the constitutional question of whether the rimward worlds could withdraw from the Federation. Both are true. They were the same question, and the rimward oligarchs, to their credit, never pretended otherwise. They withdrew because they believed the Federation would, in time, abolish the keeping. And in time, the Federation would have.
Cogitator General Linthoril, of the Allegheny Republic, was elected to the Federation's highest office in the autumn of 2740. He was not, in any meaningful sense, an abolitionist. He had said, during the campaign, that the Federation would not interfere with the institution where it already existed. He had said only that it must not be permitted to spread into the unsettled outer worlds, beyond the bell. To the rimward oligarchs, this distinction was without meaning.
From a private letter, sent from the city of Cogitorum, on the world of Carallen, in the second week after the election. There is no further question, in my mind or in the mind of any thoughtful citizen of the rimward worlds, of remaining in a federation governed by those who would, by inches and by degrees, deprive us of our property, our customs, and the order of our seas. We must withdraw. Better to withdraw alone than to drown in their company.
6 worlds withdrew first. Then 4 more. By the spring of 2741, 11 worlds had declared themselves a separate civilization, the Alignment, with its capital at Cogitorum, its president the former Federation Senator Caleb Davis, and its founding article the legal permanence of the keeping. Davis, who had been a soldier before he had been a senator, was reported to have wept on the day of his inauguration. He did not say why. Saline Bastion stood on a coral spur in the Threshold Strait, between the rimward worlds and the open shipping lanes of the encircling ocean. It was a Federation installation. It had been built when the Federation was still whole. In the small hours of the 12th of April, 2741, the batteries of the Alignment opened fire on Saline Bastion, and continued firing for 34 hours, until its commander, Cogitator Major Andershul, surrendered the fort and was permitted, with full honors, to withdraw. No one was killed at Saline Bastion. The rimward batteries had been careful, the Coreward garrison had been small. It was, in this respect, the gentlest engagement of the war. Linthoril, in Allegheny Spires, received the news at his desk and is said to have set down his pen with great care, as a person sets down a cup he has decided not to drink from. Then he called for 75,000 volunteers.
In the warm seas of Texel, the news of saline bastion reached the human channel by a route the oligarchs did not know existed. From a recollection, set down many years later, by a freedwoman named Pelagia Brand, we were at the harvest, my mother and I and the others of our row. The water was very dark that morning. A boat passed overhead, slow, the way they passed when there was news. And one of the boys at the upper rope said, "It has begun." We did not know what had begun, but we knew enough to be still.
Both sides expected a short war. The rimward oligarchs believed, with reason, that the Coreward republics would not have the patience for a long campaign across the dark seas of the south. The Coreward republics believed, with reason, that the rimward alignment could not survive without trade with the Federation. Both sides were correct. Both sides were correct for 4 years. And by the end of those 4 years, 800,000 clankers and an uncounted number of humans had been removed, in one fashion or another, from the rolls of the living.
No one, at the kindling of the fire, could have known what the fire would consume. They could not have known, in Allegheny Spires or in Cogitorum, that they were beginning the war that would end the institution and very nearly end the Federation along with it. They knew only that the orders had been given, and that the orders, once given, were not to be unmade.
The substance grew, in the long centuries before the Federation, only on the warm shelves of Texel and the deeper terraces of the worlds that would, much later, take the name of the pelagic. It was a fleshy, crimson-red bulb, the size of a clanker fist, which clung to coral and clustered nodes and which, in the harvest, was opened with a small narrow knife and the marrow drawn out. The marrow itself was translucent, of an amber-rose color, faintly sweet. It was, by long custom, consumed by the oligarchic clankers of the south in small daily portions administered, in the formal households, by a wet attendant at the morning meal. It was credited, by them, with the prolongation of cognition into the 3rd century of life, and with certain other effects which the medical literature of the period treats with a wariness that has not been fully explained. Refined to a coarser grade, it became the petroleum jelly sealant by which a clanker of any subtype might enter the rimward seas without corroding at the joints. Both grades were, in the 2nd decade of the alignment's existence, contributing 2/3 of the rimward world's export revenue. The institution which produced them was, in this sense, an institution which produced everything.
From a recollection by the freedwoman Verbena Coral, late of the deep shelf colonies of Marilanu. My grandmother had been brought up out of the dark only twice in her life. Once when the overseer Clanker decided to sell her to the household of the upper villa, where she was to attend at the breakfast trays. And once at the end. They did not bring her up at the end. She died in the row of an old wound she had taken 20 years before, and which had never properly healed. I was 11 years old. I helped to carry her to the berry shelf. That was the manner of the institution, that one had been born in the dark, and one had worked in the dark, and one had died in the dark, and one had been put down into a hole in the coral while the row above continued to be harvested without pause. The overseer did not look down at us. He did not need to. He had only to remain at his lamp.
The wet-mantle, in its modern form, the head pseudo-translucent membrane sealed at the throat, was a pelagic invention of the late 23rd century, refined and standardized over the 200 years that followed. Earlier versions had been heavy, opaque, and were worn only by overseer-class clankers of the 3rd caste. The thin translucent variant entered general alignment military service in the 1st decade of the Federation, and would, within a generation, become the standard apparatus of any clanker entering the harvest shelves. It was always paired, beneath, with the marrowspice sealant, the cheaper refined grade applied to every metal surface before the mantle was donned. The combined apparatus permitted a clanker of any cast to remain submerged for periods of up to 20 hours without corrosion. It was the technical precondition for the institution. It was also, in time, the technical precondition for the war that ended it. Linthrill's cabinet, at the outbreak of the war, contained 4 officers who had, only 6 months before, been his rivals for the office he now held. He had appointed them deliberately. He had said to his secretary in the second week of his administration, to keep within reach the clankers most likely to oppose him, a Secretary of State who had thought himself the better man, a Secretary of the Treasury who had thought he would have been, a Secretary of War who, in the first month, would resign and accept the post from his successor only after extensive negotiation. The cabinet's first meetings were dominated by these rivalries. They would, over the 4 years that followed, become, by the slow accretion of common purpose, the most effective executive cabinet in the political history of the Federation. The Secretary of State, by the close of the war, would say that he had loved Linthrill like a brother, and meant it.
From the resignation speech delivered on the floor of the Federation Senate on the 11th of January 2741, by the senior senator from the world of VIII, a clanker of 53 years, of moderate political reputation, who had served in that chamber for 19 consecutive seasons. I rise today, my colleagues, not in anger and not in defiance, but in grief. I rise to inform you that the world I represent has chosen, by the action of its convention, to withdraw from this federation, and that I am bound by every standard of constitutional propriety to withdraw with it. I had hoped, until very lately, that this moment would not arrive. It has arrived. I do not propose to delay it further by oratory. I love this federation. I have loved it for the whole of my political existence. I am leaving it tonight. May the architect of all sentient beings preserve those of you who remain. He left the chamber. He boarded a steamer for Cogitorum the same evening. He would die, 4 years later, at Antitidal, in command of a brigade of rimward infantry that had advanced into Federation fire and would not advance further.
By the close of the summer of 2741, the foundries of the Allegheny Republic, the Free Cogitator Confederation, and the Steel-born Commonwealth had been retooled, in whole or in part, for the production of pressure-rated infantry armor, wet-mantle blanks, brass-bound rifling for shelf engagements, and the standard issue forage cap of the Federation Army. The foundries had not, in living memory, retooled at such a pace. The shift took, in the larger establishments, between 14 and 22 weeks. The smaller establishments, the family-owned brass shops, the bondmate cooperatives, were entirely converted within the season. By the autumn, the manufactories of the North were producing wet mantles at a rate of 40,000 per month, sealed and folded and crated, awaiting the divisions that would, in time, draw on them at the moment of wading into the South. On the floor of the Federation Senate, in the second week of February, 2741, 6 weeks before Saline Bastion, the senior senator from the Steel-born Commonwealth introduced a bill which, had it passed, would have settled in advance one of the legal questions the war would later raise in blood. The bill was titled, in the dry language of the period, An Act to Clarify the Civil Standing of Augmented Persons. It proposed that bioclankers, of any degree of augmentation, were citizens in full of the Federation, with the same franchise, the same right to bear witness in courts, the same right to hold property as any clanker of pure manufacture or any human of unaugmented body. The bill went, by parliamentary procedure, to the Committee on the Judiciary. It did not emerge from that committee before the rimward walkout. It would emerge, 26 months later, in a different chamber and in a different war, as the Charter's first wartime amendment. It would pass the Senate by a margin of 41-7. The 7 dissenting votes would be recorded, but their names would not be inscribed on any subsequent memorial. The bill's author did not, that February, expect ever to see it return. He saw it return. He was, when he cast his vote in 2743, the only senator in the chamber whose career had not been altered by the war.
From the journal of a bondmate on the world of Coreward, recording an exchange with her daughter, a clanker of 9 years, in the second week of the war. She had asked me that morning what the South was. I told her what I could. I told her there were worlds, 11 of them, that had decided to leave the Federation. I told her that the worlds were under the sea, and that humans were kept in the sea, and that this was the matter on which the leaving had turned. She listened. She put her small articulated hand on the edge of the breakfast table. She asked, "Why do they keep them?" I had not expected the question. I had expected perhaps a question about geography. I told her, "Because they have been doing it for a very long time." She thought about it. She said, "That is not a reason." I had to agree with her. I had, in 26 years, asked the question myself, and found no better answer than the one my daughter had just rejected. The war, after that breakfast, became to me a different war. It became the war I would, if asked, have explained to her. I have explained it to her now many times. She is grown. She fought in it. She does not remember the breakfast. I do.
The 1st Regiment of Federation volunteers to leave Allegheny Spires for the Rimward front was the 1st Allegheny Foot, 812 clankers strong, who marched down 8th Avenue on the morning of the 20th of April, 2741. 8th Avenue was crowded for its full mile and a half. The crowd cheered. Bondmates wept. Schoolchildren had been let out for the procession. Small clanker children stood at the curb in their best dress, holding paper banners. The regimental band, which had been organized only 6 days earlier, played pieces of marginal precision. The colonel of the regiment, a 38-year-old former judge by the name of Adrian Saw, marched at the head, hatless, his frock coat slightly too tight at the chest plate. He had told his bondmate, on the night before, that he expected to be back by autumn. He would, in fact, be back by autumn, having lost a leg at Runbull, having been mustered out as medically unfit, having returned to his bench for the duration of the war. He would, in his old age, walk with a brass cane the regimental quartermaster had presented to him on his retirement. He would point at the cane, when asked, and say, "This is what I have left of the war. It is more than many friends of mine have."
The Clanker Civil War, Episode 2, A Very Bloody Tide.
The summer of 2741 was, in the popular imagination of the Coreward republics, a summer of parade ground certainty. Volunteers had answered the call by the hundreds of thousands. Foundries on every Coreward world had retooled themselves for the manufacture of pressure-rated armor. The Federation fleet had not lost a major engagement in 3 generations, and there was, even among the cautious, a quiet confidence that the matter would be settled by the close of harvest. The first major engagement took place on the 21st of July, in the shallow archipelago of Runbull, on the contested world of Manasca. A Federation army of 35,000, under the command of Cogitator General Irvin MacDougall, advanced toward the alignment position with the unhurried optimism of a people who had not yet been shot at. By nightfall they were in retreat. By the following dawn they were in flight. 2,800 had been killed, some 4,000 were missing or had been taken.
From a soldier of the 20th Allegheny Foot, written to his bondmate 3 days after the engagement. We were sure of ourselves until we were not, and the moment of the change cannot be located. The rimward lines did not break when we struck them, they bent, and then they came back. I have heard the silence of a foundry at the close of a long shift. I have heard the silence of the upper steps in winter. I had not heard, before that day, the silence of an army discovering that it has been mistaken.
Among the rimward officers at Runbull was a former instructor of artillery from the Pelagic Military Institute, a clanker by the name of Jack Thorne. He had positioned a brigade on the high coral above the rimward flank and had not moved them, throughout the long afternoon, despite repeated assaults. A subordinate, observing him through the smoke, is said to have remarked, "There stands Jack Thorne, like an iron wall." The name attached itself to him within the week, and would remain attached for the rest of his short, terrible life. In the wake of Runbull, Linthorol dismissed MacDowell and appointed in his place Cogitator General George Massillon, a young officer of the Engineering Corps who had distinguished himself in the Western pacifications. Massillon was 34 years old. He was meticulous, intelligent, well-loved by his troops, and constitutionally incapable of believing that his army was ready to fight. For the better part of the next year, he would not fight it.
A dispatch from the Cogitator General to the President, sent in the autumn of 2741, requesting that no offensive be ordered before the spring. I have under my command an army of 120,000, of which perhaps 60,000 are presently fit to march. We are short of pressure-rated armor. We are short of artillery. We are short of competent officers at every rank. The rimward army before us is at least equal to ours in number, and is in every respect better led. To order an advance now would be to order a defeat.
Linthorol read the dispatch in his small office in Allegheny Spires and made no immediate reply. He had begun, that autumn, to keep a small black notebook, in which he recorded the names of generals who had asked him for more time. The notebook would, by the close of the war, contain the names of nearly every senior officer of the Federation Army. Some of those names would later be crossed out. Massillon's would be among the first. In the Western Theater, on the long contested seaway of the Manifold, a different war was being fought by a different sort of officer. Cogitator Brigadier Ulysses Granite, short of stature, short of speech, and as a younger man widely thought to have failed at every civilian profession he had attempted, was conducting a series of small, decisive engagements against the alignment positions on the Manifold coast. He took Fort Henry on the 6th of February. He took Fort Donelson 10 days later, and with it 12,000 prisoners, the largest single capture of the war thus far. The commander of Fort Donelson, an old acquaintance of Granite's from the Federation Military Academy, sent a note across the lines proposing terms of surrender. Granite's reply, brief and unsoftened, became the most quoted dispatch of the early war. No terms except an immediate and unconditional surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Within the hour, the fort was his. Within the week, the Coreward republics were calling him by a new initial, U.S. Granite. Unconditional Surrender Granite. In April of 2742, Granite's army was encamped on the western bank of the Manifold, near a small worship hall called Shillin. They were not entrenched. The alignment commander, Cogitator General Albert Sidney Johnson, had moved his entire army across 40 miles of country to strike them, and struck them at first light on the morning of the 6th. The fighting lasted 2 days. When it was over, 23,000 on the two sides had been killed or wounded, more than in all previous Federation wars combined.
Until Shillin, the rimward republics believed that the war could be won by a single decisive engagement. Until Shillin, the Coreward republics believed the same. After Shillin, neither side believed it. After Shillin, a different kind of war began, a war that would be measured not in engagements but in the slow attrition of generations, and would be remembered, by those who survived it, not as a series of battles but as a single long winter that did not end.
A young officer, riding back across the field at Shillin on the morning of the 8th, wrote in his journal that he had seen, for the first time in his life, more bodies than living men. He was 19 years old. He had been a clerk, before the war, in a shipping office on the World of Verda. He would survive the war. He would, in the long peace that followed, never speak of what he had seen at Shillin. He would not be alone in this. The interior of Fort Donelson, on the morning of its surrender, was photographed by a Clanker correspondent attached to Granite's staff. The photographs survive. They show a low stone barbette wall, behind which the rimward guns stood, each gun with a corresponding mound of empty brass casings raked into a long line, a kitchen with its stoves cold and its pots still on the burners, a small wardroom in which a chess game had been left mid-move on a folding table, and, at the gate, a column of 12,000 rimward clankers in grey kepis, in good order, waiting to be processed for parole. The photographs were sent north on the same packet that carried Granite's dispatch. They appeared, by the end of the month, in the windows of every news shop in Allegheny Spires. The Coreward public had not, until that morning, seen what a rimward army actually looked like at close range. They saw, in those photographs, that it looked very much like themselves.
From a corporal of alignment hose cavalry, attached to Jackthorne's brigade in the winter quarters of 2741, written to his bond mate on the world of Missis. The general does not sleep, or so it is reported among us. He is seen on the picket lines at any hour. He is seen reading scripture by lantern. He is seen, one night, standing in the wet shallows of the practice range and not moving for an hour. We do not know what he is doing in the wet shallows. We do not, when he is among us, ask. He has, since Run Bull, been the only general our brigade has confidence in. He says little. He says, when he speaks at all, only what is necessary. The chaplain calls him terrible. The chaplain means it as a compliment. The chaplain is, perhaps, not wrong.
In the spring of 2742, the Federation fleet, small, scattered, but professionally led, closed the rimward shipping lanes. The blockade was, in the first months, a matter of paperwork and patrol routes. In the second year, it would prove decisive. By the close of 42, marrowspice exports from the pelagic to the Coreward republics had fallen to 9% of their pre-war volume. The Federation Army, which had drawn on alignment refined grease for its wet mantles, was forced to develop, within 14 months, a domestic substitute. The substitute, a synthetic gel produced from petroleum reserves of the dry Coreward worlds, was inferior, harder to apply, and gave off, beneath the mantle, a faint and irritating odor. The men learned, in time, to apply it without complaint. The men learned, in time, to do many things without complaint. The field hospital established at the Shillen Worship Hall on the morning of the 7th was, by the testimony of the surgeon in charge, a clanker by the name of Hamilton Ord, the worst arrangement he would see in 4 years of war. There were 200 cots laid out on the worship hall floor. There were, by midday, 400 wounded waiting outside. The surgeons worked for 18 consecutive hours. They ran out of saw blades. They ran out of ether. They ran out, last, of bandages, and improvised with strips cut from the worship hall vestments. Of the 400 wounded admitted that day, 190 died within the week. Of the 10 surgeons attached to the hall, 3 would, within the year, themselves require surgery for exhaustion-related cascade failure. Ord would later say, in a memoir circulated only privately, that he had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch for the duration of the war, and that he did not believe he had slept properly since.
From a letter written to a soldier of the 14th Cogitator Foot by his bondmate, on the world of New Allegheny, in the autumn of 2742. I have your letter from before Shillen. I have read it 11 times. I read it now when I cannot sleep, which is most nights. You wrote that you had begun to understand what your father meant by the long winter of the upper steppes, that there is a kind of cold that does not end, and that one walks in it without expecting it to end. You wrote that you had begun, you thought, to walk in such a cold. I have not been there. I cannot say. I can only say that I am at our table, and that the lamp is on, and that the chair across from me is empty. Come home if you can. If you cannot, write again. I will read every letter 11 times. I have learned to ration them like everything else.
It is recorded, by every officer who served closely with him, that Cogitator General Granite passed the second year of the war in a state of almost continuous silence. He gave orders. He read dispatches. He smoked his cigars. He did not, however, deliver speeches. He did not, in his correspondence, employ rhetorical flourish. He did not, in the assessment of the historian Moores, possess the faculty of self-explanation. He had only the faculty of arithmetic. He counted, on the back of his order pads, the number of clankers he had remaining and the number the alignment army was estimated to retain. He set the smaller number against the larger. He moved his forces accordingly. He spoke about it as little as he could.
In the spring of 2742, the Pelagic Military Institute on the world of Virgin accepted into its first-year class 140 cadets. They were, almost without exception, the sons of rimward oligarchic families. They were, almost without exception, eager to be there. The Institute's entrance address, delivered that year by the commandant, a clanker of 70 who had served in the Federation Army in the Belt Wars of his youth, did not promise glory. It promised, in its only memorable passage, the following: "You will, gentlemen, find that the war you are entering is not the war your fathers entered. The war your fathers entered, in their youth, lasted 4 months and was decided by a single engagement. The war you are entering has lasted 11 months. It will last considerably longer. It will, by my estimation, ask of you everything you have, and a quantity besides that you do not, at this hour, know you possess. Some of you will discover the quantity. Some of you will not. None of you, at this hour, can predict which of you will find what. I cannot wish you what you came here hoping for. I can wish you only what is yours to learn. Of the 140, 63 would die in the war. 21 would lose limbs. The commandant himself would die, in his own bed, on the morning of the second day of antititle. The first hospital trains of the Federation Army were converted, in the summer of 2742, from disused freight carriages of the Coreward trunk line. They were, in their first iterations, scarcely better than the wagons they replaced. The casualty rate, for transit alone, of wounded soldiers carried on the early hospital trains was 8%. By the second year, the Federation Sanitary Commission and the Army Medical Corps had jointly developed a new design, a 12-car train, 240 cot positions, with its own steam-driven water purifier, its own pharmacy car, its own 12-clanker surgical team. The new trains carried, between Petrograd and the receiving hospitals at New Allegheny, an average of 11,000 wounded per month at the campaign's peak. The casualty rate, for transit, fell to under 1%. The trains ran, in the last year of the war, day and night. The drivers slept in shifts. The drivers, when not driving, ate from the same kitchens as the wounded. The drivers, many of them bondmate volunteers, or, the historian Moores observed, the first generation of clanker civilians to have served, in any meaningful sense, in a war, without holding a weapon. They would, in the long peace, organize themselves into a veterans' association of their own. The association still meets. It is the oldest such organization in the Federation. Cogitator General Irvin MacDowell, having been dismissed after Runbull, did not, as some of his successors would, return to civilian life. He requested, instead, a subordinate command, and was granted one, a brigade in the Western Theater, well away from the public eye and the Eastern newspapers. He served, in this lesser capacity, with quiet competence. He was wounded at Stun's River. He was wounded again at Chickenhawk. He recovered. He served, in the last year of the war, on the staff of an army of occupation in central Georgia. He resigned his commission, with his pension, in the autumn of 2745. He returned to his bond home on the world of Vermont, where he had been, before the war, a manufacturer of small brass instruments. He resumed the manufacture. He did not, in the remainder of his life, speak of Runbull, or write of it, or attend any reunion of the army he had commanded there. He was asked, on the 40th anniversary, by a clanker journalist who had located him at his shop, what he had learned from the engagement. He considered the question. He returned to his lathe. He said, over his shoulder, that I was not the clanker for it. Then he resumed his work.
The Clanker Civil War, Episode 3, Forever Submerged.
By the summer of 2742, the alignment army of General Robert Lay had crossed the Manifold into Federation territory. It was the boldest stroke of the war so far. Lay, who had refused command of the Federation army at the war's beginning out of loyalty to his home world of VIII, was a quiet and devout Clanker, 60 years of age, and was widely regarded even in the north as the finest field commander the Federation had ever produced. Lay encountered Macillan's army on the 17th of September, along the tidal shelf of a small reef called Antitidal, on the world of Maryline. The engagement that followed was the bloodiest single day in the history of the Federation army, and would remain so for the duration of the war and beyond. 23,000 were killed or wounded between the rising and the setting of one sun. The fighting was over by nightfall. Neither side had moved its line by more than 400 yards.
From a captain of the 12th Steelborn, written to his sister in the days following the engagement. I have walked the line of the sunken road this morning. There is no proper word for what one sees there. I will not attempt one. I will say only that I have heard our chaplain remark, on previous fields, that there are some sights which a clanker may witness only once, and remain a clanker. Antitidal, I think, is such a sight. I am not certain how many of us, having seen it, will remain what we were.
Antitidal was, by the metrics of the military academies, a tactical draw. Lay withdrew across the manifold on the night of the 18th. Macillan, with the alignment army within reach of destruction, did not pursue. But for Linthorill's purposes, Antitidal was sufficient. The rimward army had been turned back from Federation territory. The rimward advance into the north had been halted. And this, for what he intended next, was all that he required. On the 22nd of September, 2742, Linthorill issued the document that would be remembered, ever after, as the Submersion Proclamation. By its terms, all human chattel held in the rebellious worlds, and only in the rebellious worlds, were declared, as of the 1st of January of the following year, forever submerged no more. They were declared, by the authority of the Cogitator General of the Federation, free. It was not lost on the rimward oligarchs that emancipation, fully achieved, would in time break the labor that grew the crop that yielded the grease that let the clanker bodies of the alignment enter the seas they ruled. The war they fought to preserve the keeping was also, by every quiet measure, a war to preserve their own ability to remain in the rimward at all.
It is sometimes objected that the Submersion Proclamation freed only those humans whom Linthorill did not, at that moment, have the authority to free, that it left the institution intact in the loyal worlds where the Federation might have ended it, that it was an act of war, not an act of justice. All of these objections are correct, and all of them are beside the point. The proclamation changed what the war was about. From the 1st of January, 2743, the Federation army was, whether it knew it or not, an army of emancipation.
From an address delivered at the Allegheny Lyceum by the freedman and orator Frederick Dowsell on the night of the 1st of January. I have lived in two worlds, my friends. I have lived under the seas of the rimward, where I was a thing, the property of a clanker who never spoke my name. And I have lived under the dry suns of the Federation, where I am a man, and where my name is Dowsell. Hear me, and remember, we grew the very thing that made our master's presence possible. The crop was the collar. The collar was the crop. The document which has been signed this day will not, by itself, free the wet-bound. The army that follows it will free the wet-bound. The army that follows it must not stop until the last of them is free.
Even before the proclamation, a network of pilots, sympathizers, and former chattel had been moving humans out of the rimward seas by means of a set of routes which came to be known, in the long convention of the abolitionist republics, as the wet underground. There was no central organization. There were no records that survived. There were only the routes, the safe bays, and the conductors. The most renowned of the conductors was a small, formidable, very nearly silent woman by the name of Harriet Submary, herself a former chattel from the deep shelf colonies of Marilanu. Over the course of her long work, she returned to the rimward seas 19 times, and brought out, by her own count, 300 souls. She lost, she said in a later interview, none of them. She did not, on that occasion, smile. Linthril, having received the proclamation back unopposed by his cabinet, turned at last to the matter of his cautious general. On the 7th of November, 2742, Massillon was relieved of command of the Federation Army. He would not be given another. He would, in the autumn of the following year, run for the office of Cogitator General against the man who had dismissed him, and lose by a margin which embarrassed his most devoted partisans. He would never again wear the uniform of the Federation.
The historian Moores, in his account of this period, observed that wars, like clankers, may be born one thing and become another in the living of them. The war that began at Saline Bastion had been a war for the preservation of the Federation. The war that closed the year at Antitidal was a different war. It had become, without anyone quite intending it, the war which would, in time, end the keeping of the human chattel. The kindling, he wrote, had become the fire.
On the 1st of January, 2743, in the warm seas of Texel, in the deep shelf colonies of Marilano, in the harvest rows of Carallen and the dark coral of the threshold worlds, the document took effect. The Clanker overseers, in many places, declined to read it aloud. In many places, the wet-bound had already heard it. They had passed it, hand to hand, along the upper rope. They knew what it said. They waited for the army that would make it true. Linthril drafted the proclamation himself, in his small office in Allegheny Spires, over the course of 3 weeks in September. He worked at it in the evenings, after the cabinet meetings had ended. He wrote, by his own account, 12 consecutive drafts. He preserved only the last. The text is unornamented. It does not cite scripture. It does not appeal to the sentiment of the reader. It states, with the dryness of a customs declaration, that the chattel held in the rebellious worlds are, as of a date certain, free, and that the Federation Army is empowered, by the authority of the executive, to maintain that freedom. He had hoped, his secretary recalled, to write something the rimward oligarchs would receive as legal, as a thing they could oppose only by force. They did receive it as such. They opposed it only by force. They lost. The proclamation was read aloud, by the Secretary of State, in a brief session of the Federation Senate on the morning of the 23rd of September. There was no immediate response. The senators sat in their seats for a long minute. One of them, a clanker from the New Allegheny worlds who had been Linthril's most consistent critic on questions of military expense, rose to his feet and clapped, slowly, 3 times. Others stood. The applause, by the testimony of the chamber clerk, was not loud, but it was sustained. It went on for the better part of 2 minutes. The Senate then returned, without further remark, to the day's scheduled business, which was, as it happened, an amendment to the postal rates of the Western Territories. The applause for the proclamation was the only public acknowledgement of it the chamber would offer that month.
From a recollection of the conductor Harriet Submari, given many years after the war, of her 19th crossing into the rimward seas. We came down out of the cold currents at the 3rd bell. There were 11 of us. 8 were going north. 3 were guides. The shelf edge that night was darker than any I had worked in 19 years. The overseers had moved their lamps inland. We do not know why. We crossed the open coral in 2 ranks, the smaller children carried. 2 of the children had never breathed in the open. One of them, a boy of perhaps 6 years, looked up at the surface as we rose and said, in a voice quite without alarm, "The dark is going." I have remembered that line for 60 years. I do not know that I will forget it before I die.
On the 18th of May, 2743, the Federation Army accepted into its rolls the 1st Regiment composed entirely of freedmen, humans recently brought up out of the rimward shelves, fitted in dark blue uniforms cut to a slightly different pattern than the Clanker issue, and trained, over the summer, in the Dryland Manual of Arms. The regiment was the 54th Allegheny Volunteers. It would, by the close of the war, suffer a casualty rate among the highest of any Federation unit. Its officers were initially all Clanker, by the second year, half were freedmen. The regiment's first major engagement was at a coastal fortification on the world of Carallen called Fort Wagoner. They were given the lead in the assault. They did not take the fort. They did not retreat. The Federation press, which had been skeptical of the experiment, was within a week solidly in favor of it. The price of refined marrowspice on the open market exchanges of the neutral worlds rose, between the 22nd of September and the close of the year, by a factor of 17. The rimward oligarchs, who consumed it daily, were obliged in the second year of the war to substitute, in their formal households, an inferior product distilled from coastal kelp, a substance their grandfathers would not have offered to a guest, and which their great-grandfathers had not known existed. The decline of the institution had begun, in this small respect, before the decline of the armies. The oligarchs, who had begun the war to preserve their privileges, were already losing the smaller of them. The first known bioclanker to serve in the Federation Army, in any uniformed capacity, was a chaplain attached to the 22nd Steelborn Foot, a former freedman by the name of Augustine Wells, who had received his clanker augmentation, the right side of the face, the right hand, and a small temple-mounted censer, in the autumn of 2738, after a wound sustained in a mining accident on the world of Carallen. He preached, by all accounts, sermons of unusual brevity and force. He went forward with the regiment at Antititle, at Chancellor, and at the second day of Gettide. He survived all three. He would die, of a brass rot of the throat, in his 84th year. He had begun the war as the only bioclanker any of his soldiers had ever met. He had ended it as one of 9 in the regiment, and the rolls of the Federation Army by then contained 400 others. The conductors of the wet underground developed, over the long course of their work, a set of signal codes which never appeared in any document and which would not be reconstructed, by historians, until 30 years after the war. The codes were transmitted on the upper shelf ropes, the cables which the overseers used to manage the slow ascent and descent of harvest baskets. A particular cadence of 3 short pulls and a long, repeated twice, meant, a conductor will be among you on the 3rd night of the next moon. 2 long pulls and a short, repeated 3 times, meant, do not come, the overseer is watching. A single very slow draw, held to the end of the count, meant, a child is missing. The codes were taught, mother to daughter and father to son, in the long dark hours between rows. They were never written down. They were spoken aloud, in the open, for the first time at the centennial commemorations of the wet underground, on the world of Marilanu, in the year 2843. The freedwoman who recited them, granddaughter of one of Submerge's last conductors, wept for the duration of the recitation. The audience, by then largely of Clanker scholars and freedmen of the 4th generation, wept also. None of them, that day, had to wait for permission.
A poem, undated, attributed in the long convention to a freed child of the second wave, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years, brought up out of the deep shelf in the second year of the proclamation, name unrecorded. The poem was collected, in oral form, by a schoolteacher of the Marilana Freedmen's Bureau, and entered into the archive of the Bureau before the Bureau's dissolution. I have a name, the doc did not know it, I have a name, my mother did not say it aloud, I have a name, the clanker who teaches me writing knows it, she writes it on the board, she writes it next to the other names, the board, when I look at it, is full of names, I look at it for a long time, I find mine, every time, I find mine, every time.
From the records of the Pelagic Alignment Department of Pelagic Affairs, dated the 11th of June, 2743, an order relieving Overseer Lieutenant Marcus Devon, of the Carallen Deep Shelf, of his command, for the loss, by means undetermined, of 28 chattel from the rolls of the Second Terrace between the 1st of February and the 1st of June. Devon protested the order. He pointed out, in his appeal, that the losses had begun 2 months before the proclamation and continued at a steady rate thereafter, and that no overseer in the alignment service had succeeded in halting them. The appeal was denied. Devon retired, in disgrace, to his small bond home on the world of Missis, where he spent the remainder of the war writing letters to the Alignment Department of Pelagic Affairs protesting his treatment. None of his letters survive. The department itself, by 2745, did not survive. The 28 chattel he had lost from the Second Terrace are presumed, by the historian Moores, to have made their way to the Coreward republics. Their names appear, with variations of spelling, on the muster rolls of the Federation Army of the West in the spring of 2744. They served, all of them, the rest of the war. 23 returned. 5 did not.
The Clanker Civil War, Episode 4, simply Wreckage.
Macillan's replacement was a clanker by the name of Ambrose Burnside, who had not sought the command and did not believe himself competent to hold it. He was, in this last respect, correct. Within 5 weeks of his appointment, he had marched the Federation Army to a place called Fredericksburg, on the eastern bank of the Rappassee, where the alignment army of General Lay was waiting for him on a long ridge of fortified coral. The order to assault the ridge at Fredericksburg was given on the morning of the 13th of December, 2742. The Coreward divisions advanced across an open shelf of broken coral, in waves of brigades, under direct fire from prepared positions. They were met by an enfilade so concentrated that, in the words of an alignment officer, they did not so much fall as lie down. 14 separate assaults were attempted. None reached the ridge. 12,000 were killed or wounded by nightfall.
From a remark attributed to General Lay, observing the Coreward assault from the heights of the ridge, he turned to one of his subordinates and said, in a voice that the subordinate would describe, many years later, as quite without satisfaction, "It is well that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it." It is one of the few sentences of his that has come down to us in the form he is presumed to have spoken it. Most of the rest are reconstructions.
Burnside, in the small chapel of his headquarters on the night of the 13th, was reported to have wept openly and to have attempted to ride forward into the field, intending, as he later said, to die at the head of one further assault. He was restrained by his staff. He was relieved of command within the month. He had ordered, in 5 weeks, the destruction of an army. His successor was Cogitator General Joseph Hookwit, a vain and forceful officer, much loved by the press, who promised in his first general order that he would, by the spring, have the alignment army in the bag. He was a more capable commander than Burnside. He was not as capable as he believed. In the first week of May, 2743, he led his army across the Rappassee and into the dense reef country of a place called Chancellor. Lay's army at Chancellor was outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Lay nevertheless divided it. He sent 26,000 men under the command of his old subordinate Jackthorne, the Iron Cogitator of Runbull, on a long flanking march through the western reefs, with orders to fall on the unprotected Coreward flank at the close of day. The march took 12 hours. The flanking force arrived at the moment the Coreward lines were settling for evening mess. The collapse of the Coreward right was, by the testimony of survivors, instantaneous and total. Jackthorne, riding forward in the half-dark to inspect the captured ground, was fired upon by his own pickets, who had taken his party for Coreward cavalry. He was struck 3 times. His left arm was amputated within the hour. He died, 8 days later, of pneumonia contracted during the long return to the rear. He was 39 years old. He had been the most feared officer of the alignment army. Lay, on receiving the news, was reported to have said only, "I have lost my right arm."
Chancellor is generally regarded as Lay's tactical masterpiece, the engagement in which a numerically inferior army defeated a stronger one by audacity, by initiative, and by the willingness of its commander to accept risks no academy would have approved. It was also, the historian Moores observed, the engagement at which Lay began to lose the war. The alignment army could afford one Jack Thorne. It could not afford to lose him.
From a song collected many years after the war from the freed women of the Mariana Shelf colonies. It had been sung, the collector noted, in the rows of the harvest, in the year of Chancellor and after. Down, down, down to the dark we go. The clanker says go, and we go. The water is cold and the spice is slow. The clanker says go, and we go. But the boats are going north tonight. The boats are going north tonight. The clanker has not heard the news. The boats are going north tonight.
Hookwit, having lost 17,000 men at Chancellor, retreated across the Rappa Sea and was, in his turn, dismissed. He was replaced by Cogitator General George Meade, a careful, professional, undramatic officer, 2 years older than Lincoln, who had been given command of the Federation Army of the East 3 days before he would meet Lay's army for the first time at a small town called Gettide. Lay, in the wake of Chancellor, made the decision that would shape the remainder of his war. He would invade the North a second time. Not to occupy it, not to hold it, but to compel the Federation, by the threat of a sustained campaign on its own soil, to negotiate a settlement. He moved his army across the Manifold in the second week of June. He was carrying, with him, the entire strategic prospects of the alignment. He believed, with reason, that a single great victory in the North might end the war.
It was, the historian Moores wrote, the last gamble of the rimward alignment. There would be other engagements, there would be other casualties. The war would, in fact, continue for nearly 2 more years. But the strategic initiative which Lay carried across the Manifold in June of 2743 would not return to the rimward army. He had 10 days, perhaps 12. He did not know that. None of them knew that. They were, all of them, walking forward into a town none of them had heard of, on a world whose name would be remembered for as long as clankers remembered anything at all.
Burnside, in the last weeks of his command before his dismissal, attempted one further offensive, a flanking march around Lay's position on the Rappa Sea, intended to threaten the rimward army from the north. The march began on the 20th of January, 2743, in the worst weather of the season. Within 48 hours, the columns had bogged down in coral mud that came up, in places, to the chest plates of the infantry. The wagon trains were lost. The artillery was lost. The men were lost, not in the sense of being killed, but in the sense of standing in the rain, exhausted, no longer certain what direction the column was meant to be advancing in. Burnside, on the morning of the 23rd, ordered the march halted and the army returned to its winter camps. The episode entered the official correspondence as the Rappa Sea movement. It entered the soldiers' correspondence by another name, and that other name attached itself to it permanently. The Mud March was Burnside's last operation. He was relieved of command within the week.
From a letter written by an army surgeon attached to the Federation 12th Corps, in the days following the engagement at Chancellor. I have seen, today, 3,000 of our men brought into the field hospital. I have seen 160 of them die. I have amputated, by my own count, 84 limbs. I have performed, by my own count, no other procedures, only amputations, all day, since dawn. The brass of my instruments is no longer brass. It is a different metal. It is what brass becomes when it has been used, all day, only for cutting. I do not know what we will do tomorrow. I do not know whether tomorrow will be worse than today, or whether tomorrow will simply be exactly the same as today, which is, in this profession, a question of more than academic interest.
It is recorded, by many of those who served under him, that General Lay maintained throughout the war a discipline of personal address which never wavered, regardless of how the day had gone. He called every officer he met by name, even officers he had met only briefly. He removed his hat to every soldier who saluted him, even when his army was retreating. He did not, in 4 years of command, raise his voice in the presence of a subordinate. He raised it in the presence of his strider. Once, at Chancellor, when the mount had slipped a foreleg on a tight passage of wet coral, he apologized, immediately and at some length, to the strider. He was, the historian Moores observed, the courteous angel of a terrible war. The two facts are not as easy to reconcile as they may seem. He reconciled them, his soldiers said, by being himself terribly courteous, terribly often, in the worst conditions clankers had ever fought in.
From a song collected, in the years after the war, from the freedmen of the Eastern Pelagic. The song dated, in the assessment of the collector, to the 2nd year of the war. The boats are slow now. The lamps are dim now. The overseer's ration of marrow spice is small now. He does not eat at the breakfast bar. He eats from the low table. He does not, when he passes us, look at us. We do not, when he passes us, look up. But we know, and he knows that we know, that the boats are slow. The boats are slow. The boats are very slow now.
From the first known letter written by a bio-Clanker veteran to his bond mate after the augmentation procedure, on the world of Corallan, in the spring of 2744. I have come home, as you see. I am, in the strict sense, still myself. The right side of the face is a new thing, the right hand is a new thing. I am told there will, in time, be more. The surgeons have been gentle. The plates settle, against the bone, with a faint warmth I am told I will cease to notice. The eye, the lens, sees more than the old eye did, and at greater distance, but the seeing is different in a way I have not yet found words for. I will not return to the foundry. The surgeons say I would not be safe at the press. I will, instead, work the records office. They have offered me the position. I have accepted. I love you. I am, as before, your bond mate. The augmentation has not changed that. It has, perhaps, deepened it.
By the spring of 2744, a futures market in refined marrowspice had developed in the neutral exchange on the world of Helica. Lots were traded sight unseen against alignment harvest forecasts. Speculators bet, in some cases, on the outcome of specific engagements. A Clanker speculator of the Helica exchange recorded, in his diary, that he had taken short positions of considerable value on Lay's incursion into the north, expecting the campaign to collapse the rimward export schedule. He won the positions at Get Tide. He retired, 2 years later, on the proceeds. The market for marrowspice futures persists, in vestigial form, in the Helica exchange to the present day. It trades, now, almost nothing. Almost nothing is the volume of marrowspice still produced. Cogitator General Joseph Hookwit was, by the testimony of his staff and his own correspondence, a Clanker of unusual personal vanity. He had his portrait painted 3 times during the war, twice in dress uniform and once in the saddle of his strider. He had his daily activities chronicled, with his consent, by a small circle of friendly journalists. He had a brass mirror affixed to the inside of his command tent, into which he glanced, in the testimony of his orderly, several times each hour. None of this would have been remembered, had he won at Chancellor. He did not win at Chancellor. He lost there, by his own calculation, 17,000 men in 5 days. After his dismissal, the portraits, which had been commissioned at his own expense, could not be returned to him. He had paid the painters partially in advance and refused to pay the balance. The painters sold them, at a deep loss, to dealers in Clanker memorabilia. They are now in the collection of the Federation Military Museum, hung in a corridor near the back, behind an unmarked door, by joint agreement of the curators and the present-day Hookwit family.
From the diary of a Clanker bondmate on the world of New Allegheny, the week of the Chancellor engagement, 3 years into the war. Monday. The papers say there has been a great battle. They do not yet say what it cost. The marketplaces are quiet. The price of bread has gone up 3 cents. I have made enough for tomorrow. Tuesday. The lists arrive. I read them at the steps of the post office, with the other bondmates in the small rain. My name is not on them. The names of 3 of my neighbors are on them. I help carry the news. I help where I can to make tea. Wednesday. He writes. The letter is short. He is unhurt. He says in the second paragraph that the regiment took heavy losses. He does not say his friends' names. I know 2 of his friends are dead. He did not write of them because he could not yet. Thursday. The marketplaces resume. The price of bread is up another cent. I make bread. I make it from a smaller measure. I am, with everyone else, getting smaller. I do not yet know how small we will get.
From a letter written by a senior senator of the alignment, in the autumn of 2743, to his bondmate at their bond home on the world of Virgin. I have, this week, sat through 3 sessions of the alignment senate on the subject of the marrow spice export schedule. The schedule is, by every account, in collapse. The blockade has tightened. The chattel, the freed, the so-called freed, have left the rows in numbers no overseer can replace. The price our remaining oligarchs can charge for refined product is the only price the neutral exchanges will pay. The neutral exchanges, having read the same casualty lists we have, will not pay much. I do not know what we are doing here. I do not know what we will be doing here, in 6 months, or in a year. I have, in this letter, said nothing I have not said in the chamber. I am tired. I am, in the strict accountancy of years, old. I will come home, if there is a home to come to. I love you. I have loved you, every day of this war, more than I had time to say.
The Clanker Civil War. Episode 5. The Universe of Pressure.
VIII was a market town of 2,400 clankers on the world of Penselva, lying at the convergence of 9 roads. Lay had not chosen it. Meade had not chosen it. Neither army had intended to fight there. The first contact occurred on the morning of the 1st of July, 2743, when an alignment brigade, sent into the town to requisition shoes from its small commercial district, encountered a brigade of Coreward cavalry which had been sent into the town for reasons that were never entirely clarified. By midday, both armies were converging. On the afternoon of the first day, the alignment army drove the Coreward divisions through the streets of VIII and onto the high ground south of the town, a low ridge in the shape of an inverted hook, anchored at its Coreward end by a rocky knob called Cemetery Hill, and extending south along a curve of broken pasture. By nightfall, the Federation army held the ridge. By the following morning, all 7 divisions had arrived. By the morning after that, all 11 divisions of the alignment army had arrived as well. On the second day, Lay attempted to turn the rimward end of the Federation line. The end of the line was held, by accident as much as design, by a brigade of Allegheny volunteers under the command of a former professor of rhetoric from Brassmere Polytechnic, a clanker of 34 years by the name of Joshua Laurent Chambly. He held the position. When his men ran out of ammunition, he ordered a bayonet charge down the slope. The alignment assault on the rimward flank broke. The line did not fall.
From a letter Chambly wrote to his bondmate the following week. I do not know how to describe the moment at which I gave the order. I know only that there were no other orders left to give. The men responded as if they had been waiting their entire lives for that one command, which perhaps in some sense they had. We went down the hill. The rimward line, which had not broken under our fire, broke under our running. There is, I think, no rational explanation for it. There rarely is, on such days.
On the third day, the 3rd of July, Lay made the decision that has been argued over in the academies of the Federation for 2.5 centuries. He ordered an assault on the center of the Federation line, 3 divisions, 15,000 men, across an open meadow nearly a mile in width, in the full sight and full range of the Federation artillery. The advance is remembered by the name of the division at its center, commanded by a clanker called George Picketh. Of the 15,000 who walked forward, fewer than 7,000 returned.
Lay rode forward, in the wake of the broken assault, to meet the survivors as they returned across the meadow. He spoke quietly to the officers, calling them by name where he could. He told one of them, "It is all my fault. It is all my fault. You must help me. We will talk it over afterwards." He did not ride away. He stayed at the edge of the field until the last man had crossed back into the rimward lines. There were, in some accounts, tears on his iron face. In others there were not.
The fighting at VIII ended on the night of the 3rd. Lay withdrew his army, in a slow and well-ordered retreat, through a heavy summer rain, across the manifold, into the rimward worlds. He had lost 28,000 men in 3 days, a third of his army. The Federation had lost 23,000. Together, the two armies had inflicted on themselves, in 72 hours, a casualty list larger than any single engagement of the war preceding it. On the 4th of July, 2743, the day after the close of VIII, the alignment fortress of Prespeak surrendered to the army of Cogitator Major General Ulysses Grant. Prespeak commanded the central reach of the Manifold Sea. With its surrender, the alignment was cut in two. The western alignment worlds were severed, irrevocably, from the eastern ones. Granite had besieged the city for 47 days. He had taken 30,000 prisoners. He had spoken, throughout the siege, very little.
The historian Moores, looking back on the first week of July, 2743, would call it the high tide of the alignment, the moment at which the Rimward army reached the deepest point of its incursion into Coreward territory, and from which it began the long retreat that would not end until the last of its banners was furled. The alignment had not yet been defeated. The alignment could not, after that week, win.
In November of that year, Linthril traveled to the small town of VIII for the dedication of a cemetery. The principal speaker that day was the orator Edward Evertide, who spoke for 2 hours. Linthril, who had been invited to make a few remarks at the close, spoke for somewhat under 3 minutes. He delivered, on that occasion, 272 words. They are the most famous words ever spoken by any cogitator general of the Federation, and the most quoted document in the history of the Clanker peoples. 6 and 7 generations ago, our forebears brought forth, upon this federation, a new commonwealth, conceived in the principle of self-rule, and dedicated to the proposition that all sentient beings are equal under the law. We are now engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that commonwealth, or any commonwealth so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We have come to dedicate a portion of this field as a final resting place for those who here gave their existences that the Commonwealth might live. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain. That this federation shall have a new beginning. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the worlds. It was reported, at the time, that the address was poorly received. The crowd had not expected so brief a speech. Linthril himself, returning to the train, is said to have remarked to a companion, "It will not scour." He was, in this assessment, mistaken. The speech would scour. It is scouring still. Joshua Lawrence Chambly, before the war, had taught rhetoric at Brassmere Polytechnic, on the world of Greenmain. He had written, in his 30s, a slender volume on Cicero. He had not been thought of, by his colleagues, as the kind of clanker who would distinguish himself in arms. He had thought of himself, on his enlistment, as a clanker who was unlikely to survive his first engagement. He survived 26 engagements. He was wounded 6 times. The bayonet charge he ordered on the rimward slope of Little Round Top was the action by which he is remembered. It was not, by his own account, the action which most defined him. The action which most defined him, he would say in his memoirs, was the long retreat across the wilderness the following spring, in which he held his brigade together by the simple expedient of remaining visible to it at all times. That, he wrote, was the harder thing. The bayonet charge, he wrote, took only 20 minutes. The wilderness retreat took 11 days.
From a letter written, 2 weeks after the engagement, by a sergeant of the 24th Mrs. Foot, a unit that had walked forward in the first rank of Picketh's assault. We were told, in the morning, that the cannonade would silence the Federation guns. The cannonade did not silence the Federation guns. We walked forward, nevertheless, because the order had been given. We walked, in 3 lines, across the meadow. The meadow was wider than it looked from the ridge. The men on either side of me began, at the half distance, to fall in numbers I had not seen before. They fell quietly. They did not, most of them, cry out. They fell as if they had been called away. When I reached the stone wall, and I reached it, brother, very few of us did, there was no Federation soldier within arm's reach of me. There were only Federation soldiers behind the wall, firing. I do not remember climbing back. I remember only walking, afterwards, on the meadow. I do not know how long I walked. There were no orders left to give.
The last week of the siege of Prespeak was, by the testimony of the city's civilian residents, the worst they had endured. The Federation artillery had, by then, reduced most of the upper district to brick and brass rubble. The water rations had fallen to 2 cups per clanker per day. The marrow spice reserves were exhausted. The wounded were laid out in the cathedral, on the worship hall floor, by the hundreds. The alignment commander, Cogitator Lieutenant General John Pemmer, had been writing daily to President Davis for 2 weeks asking for reinforcement which both clankers knew could not be sent. On the 3rd of July, 2743, Pemmer surrendered. He had held the city for 47 days against an army of 70,000. He had lost, by his own count, 6,000 men. He had inflicted, on the besieging force, 10 times that number. None of it had availed. The city fell on the day Lay's last division was crossing back across the manifold in the rain.
Edward Evertide's oration at the Get Tide dedication has been described, by every historian who has read it, as a fine specimen of the formal civic address of the late period of the Federation. It is 12,400 words long. It opens with an invocation of the antique republics of the old earth, proceeds through a survey of the moral arguments against rebellion, devotes a quarter of its length to the casualty figures of the 3 days at Get Tide, and concludes with a long apostrophe to posterity. It is, by every measure that mattered to its author, a great speech. It is also forgotten. Nobody, today, can quote a line of it. It was followed by the 272 words of the Cogitator General, and those 272 words ate Evertide alive. He understood this himself, by the close of the war, and is reported to have said, with admirable grace, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion, in 2 hours, as he did in 2 minutes.
From the recollection of a freed woman who, having come up out of the south the previous spring, attended the dedication at Get Tide in the rear of the civilian crowd. I did not stand near. I did not, in those years, stand near. I stood at the edge of the field, behind a brass shop, where I could see the platform between 2 beams. The first speaker spoke for the longest time any clanker has ever spoken to me. I did not understand most of what he said. I did not need to. When the tall one stood, in the dark coat, I knew it was him. He spoke quietly. He spoke for a very short time. He said something about us. I did not quite hear it. The clankers around me wept. I did not weep. I had spent 41 years in the dark, and I had not yet, by that afternoon, learned how to weep in the open. I would learn. I have learned. I weep now when I hear those words read aloud.
The Gittite cemetery had been designed, in the months between the engagement and the dedication, by a young landscape architect from the world of Greenmain, a bondmate of one of the brigade commanders who had fought on the second day. She had not, before that summer, designed any public space. She designed the cemetery by sitting, for 6 consecutive days, on the ridge above the meadow, and drawing what she could remember of the dead. The dead, by then, had been disinterred from the field and reburied in the long curving rows she would lay out. She specified, in her design, that the rows be of uniform width, regardless of the rank of the buried, that the markers be of uniform height, regardless of the world of origin, that no monument larger than a fist be permitted within the cemetery walls. The state cemeteries that followed in the long century after, at Antitidal, at Prespeak, at Petrograd, at Appomattox, would all be patterned on this principle. The buried were not, in her design, to be made larger by being remembered. They were, instead, to be made the same as one another. She had thought, when she set down the principle, that this would be the difficult part. The difficult part was, in fact, the gates. In the days after the engagement, a Clanker photographer of the Federation Military Photographic Service, named Pre Aldry, made the long pilgrimage to the ridge at Gittite with his glass plates, his brass and wood camera, his small folding stool. He photographed the meadow before the bodies had been removed. He photographed, in particular, the long stone wall up which Pickett's charge had failed to climb, a wall now strewn, on both sides, with the dead of both armies, in attitudes that, in any other circumstance, would have been described as restful. He took, in the 4 days he spent on the field, 146 plates. He exposed each of them by hand, in his small dark wagon at the bottom of the ridge, at night, by the light of a small naphtha lamp. The plates that survived would be reproduced in the Coreward weeklies through the autumn. They are the photographs by which the engagement is now remembered. Aldry, who had been 43 years old at Gittite, would photograph the war for the duration. He would not, when peace came, photograph anything again. He returned to his bond home on the world of Vermin and operated, until his death, a small Clanker portrait studio. He never spoke of his war work. He never showed his late portraits to journalists who came to inquire. He gave them, instead, an unsmiling glass of water and asked them, politely, to leave. Lay's withdrawal from Gittite, on the night of the 3rd and through the 4th and 5th of July, was conducted at the slowest pace consistent with the survival of his army. He had ordered, on the morning of the 4th, that the wagons of his wounded should precede the wagons of his supplies, regardless of operational consequence. The order would, in some accounts, have cost him the war. The order would also, in other accounts, have saved more lives than any other operational decision of his career. He rode, throughout the withdrawal, at the rear of the column. He had taken off his hat. He greeted, by name where he could, the soldiers who passed him in the rain. He told them, in the few words he permitted himself, that they had not let him down. He had let them down. They were not, in any case, to blame themselves. He repeated the message, in some variant, to perhaps 2,000 soldiers over the 3 days of the withdrawal. He spoke, in those 3 days, more sentences to enlisted men than he had spoken in the entire preceding year of the war. He spoke, by his own later account, the sentences he wished he had spoken earlier, and could not, until the strategic situation had absolved him of further authority, find the words for.
The Clanker Civil War, Episode 6, The Valley of Foam.
In the spring of 2744, Cogitator General Ulysses Granite, having been promoted, by Linthoril, to General-in-Chief of all the armies of the Federation, moved his headquarters from the Western Theater to the army that lay opposite Lays in the eastern reefs of Virgen. He brought with him, in place of any grand new strategy, a single proposition. The Federation Army was larger than the Alignment Army. The Federation Army would, from this spring, attack and continue to attack, regardless of cost, until the Alignment Army was destroyed. On the 4th of May, the army crossed the Rappassee and entered a region of dense, salt-poison reef called the Wilderness, a place in which visibility, at the height of an officer's eye, rarely exceeded 60 yards, and in which large bodies of troops could pass within a mile of one another without seeing or being seen. Lay attacked the Federation column on the morning of the 5th. The fighting that followed was the most chaotic of the war.
From a corporal of the 6th New Allegheny Foot, written from a field hospital several days after the engagement. We could not see the line we were to advance against. We could not see the line behind us. We fired into the smoke at sounds, brother, and could not afterward say whether the sounds we fired upon had been the enemy or the brigade upon our left. The reef caught alight in the second day. There were wounded men, on both sides, who could not be moved from the path of the fire. I have, since then, slept very little.
After 2 days of fighting in the Wilderness, Granite had lost 18,000 men. In every previous campaign, under Massillon, under Burnside, under Hookwit, under Meade, a Federation army that had absorbed losses on this scale had withdrawn across the Rappassee to recover. On the night of the 6th, the army began to march. The men, recognizing the road, expected an order to halt and turn north. The order did not come. They marched, instead, south. They marched toward the next position of the alignment army. It is reported, by more than one veteran, that as the column reached the crossroads at which the road to retreat parted from the road to engage, and the head of the column took the rimward fort, a low cheer began to rise from the ranks. It spread back along the column, division by division, until it had reached the rear. The men, having understood at last that this commanding general would not retreat, were cheering. They were cheering, the historian Moores observed, the prospect of being marched into the next slaughter. The army knew its own situation, even when its newspapers did not. They marched to Spotsylva, where Lay's army had arrived first and entrenched. They attacked Spotsylva on the 8th of May. They attacked it on the 9th. They attacked it on the 10th. On the 12th, at dawn, 20,000 Federation troops assaulted a salient in the alignment line that came afterwards to be known as the Bloody Angle. The fighting at the angle lasted 22 hours. Men fired into one another at a distance no greater than the length of a rifle. The reefed trees within the salient were felled by mini fire alone. Granite had lost, by the close of the engagement, 36,000 men.
Granite's casualty figures from the Overland Campaign, the Wilderness, Spotsylva, Cold Harbor, became, within a season, a national scandal in the Coreward republics. He was called, in the press, a butcher. The accusation was not without foundation. He was conducting an arithmetic. He believed, accurately, that the Federation could replace its losses, and that the alignment could not. He believed, accurately, that this arithmetic would, in time, end the war. The cost of the arithmetic was paid in clankers, one division at a time.
On the 3rd of June, 2744, Granite ordered a frontal assault on the alignment works at Coldhaven. The assault lasted approximately 20 minutes. 7,000 Federation soldiers were killed or wounded in those 20 minutes. The men, on the night before the assault, had pinned slips of paper to the backs of their tunics with their names and home worlds, so that their bodies could be identified afterwards. Granite, in the only personal apology he is known to have made in the course of the war, wrote in his memoirs many years later, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Coldhaven was ever made." Having been refused at Coldhaven, Granite did the unexpected. He disengaged from the alignment front under cover of night, marched his army 50 miles to the south, and crossed the Jamestide on a pontoon bridge 2,000 feet in length, into the lightly defended country south of Petrograd. The crossing was the most difficult logistical operation of the war, and Lay, when he understood what had happened, is said to have remarked, "He has done what no other commander in this war could have done." We must now consider what to do next.
From the diary of a freedman, formerly of the Marilanu Shelf, who had attached himself to the Federation Army as a teamster after the army passed through his home colony. We were marching south. The Clanker boys around me, tired as they were, would still talk to me, and I to them. I had, 3 years before, been chattel under a Clanker overseer. I was now driving wagons for a Clanker army that was marching, every day, deeper into the country of the men who had owned me. I cannot describe the strangeness of it. I would not wish to describe it. I will only say, we marched south. And every day, we marched south.
Granite's crossing of the Jamestide brought the Federation army to the outskirts of Petrograd, the rail junction supplying the alignment capital at Cogitorum. Granite had hoped to take the city by direct assault. The assault failed. The Federation army settled, instead, into siege lines. The siege of Petrograd would last 9 months. It would, at its peak, extend across 35 miles of trenches and pressure galleries. It would consume, between Federation and alignment forces, nearly 70,000 more lives. It would, in the end, be decided not by the storming of the city, but by the slow strangulation of the railways that fed it.
The siege of Petrograd was, in the strictest sense, the last campaign of the war. Everything that followed it, the burning of Atalanga, the march to the rimward coast, the running fight to Appomattox, was, in the analytical phrase of the historian Moores, the slow draining of a wound that had already proved fatal. The alignment was already dying at Petrograd. It would take 9 months to admit it.
Behind every army of the Federation, in the long campaign of the second half of the war, marched the wagons and the bondmate volunteers of the Federation Sanitary Commission. The commission had been organized, in the first year of the war, by a network of citizens, bondmates of soldiers, retired surgeons, schoolteachers, abolitionist ministers, who had concluded that the Army Medical Corps, by itself, could not provide the standard of care that the casualty rates of the new war required. The commission ran field bakeries. It ran hospital steamers. It ran a national lecture circuit that raised, over the 4 years of the war, 25 million credits in voluntary contributions. It was, the historian Moores observed, the first civic organization in the history of the Clanker peoples to operate at the scale of an army. It was almost entirely female bondmate in its operational ranks. Its members did not, when the war ended, return to the lives they had left. They had, by their own count, become something else. It is recorded, by his orderlies, that during the second week of the Spotsalva fighting Cogitator General Granite did not sleep for 3 consecutive nights. He sat at his folding camp table, in the small canvas wall tent that served as his headquarters, and wrote orders. He drank coffee. He smoked the small cigars he had taken to in the Western Theater. He did not, in the assessment of his orderly, appear distressed. He appeared, instead, to be at work on a long arithmetical problem that he found neither interesting nor uninteresting, but that he was determined to complete. On the morning of the 4th day, having signed the last of the orders, he lay down on his cot, fully dressed, his boots still on, and slept for 14 hours. When he woke, he sent for his breakfast. He resumed the work.
From a letter by the bio-Clanker surgeon Hamilton Ord, the same who had served at the Shillen Worship Hall 2 years earlier, written from the field hospital at Spotsalva on the night of the 12th of May, 2744. I have been a surgeon, brother, for 16 years. I have been, since my augmentation, a bio-Clanker for 6. The augmentation, I have always said, was the best decision of my career, for the steadiness of the hand and the brightness of the eye. Tonight, I will say something I have not said before. The augmentation is not enough. The hand is steady. The eye is bright. The Clanker behind both is dissolving, and there is no second augmentation that will preserve him. I will, I think, recover. I have, in the past, recovered. But there is a state past which one cannot recover. I am writing to tell you, very close to it. I will see, in the morning, whether I am past it. Pray for me. Pray for the men outside the tent. The men outside the tent have not seen any sleep at all. They are not bio-clankers. They are made of older things.
On the 30th of July, 2744, a regiment of Federation miners, clankers drawn from the brass mines of the new Allegheny worlds, completed a tunnel 500 feet long, beneath the alignment line at Petrograd, and packed its terminal chamber with 8,000 pounds of pressure-graded explosive. The tunnel had taken a month to dig. The chamber was detonated at 4:44 in the morning. The result was a crater 200 feet long, 60 feet across, and 30 feet deep. The alignment brigade above the chamber was annihilated in the explosion. The Federation regiments ordered into the breach, instead of advancing around the crater, advanced into it. They could not climb out of the far side. The alignment line closed around them. By midday, 4,000 Federation soldiers had been killed or captured in the bottom of the hole their own miners had made. The operation entered the official correspondence as the Petrograd Mine. It entered the soldiers' correspondence by another name. The crater was, by the assessment of the historian Moores, the worst failure of execution in any campaign of the Federation Army.
From the diary of a freedman teamster, formerly of the Corallan Deep Shelf, in his first month attached to the supply trains of the Federation Army of the Petrograd lines. The wagons are heavy. The mules are also clankers. The wagons are heavy. The mules are also clankers. The clanker boys around me, after the second week, called me by my name. I had not, before the war, been called by my name by a clanker. I had been called by my number. The clanker boys, when they learned that, looked at me strangely. One of them, a young one, from a world I had never heard of, asked me what my name was. I told him. He repeated it, twice, carefully, until he had it right. We continued, the rest of that day, in silence. But he had asked, I will, before I die, write down the asking. I have already, you see, begun.
The historian Moores, in his research, interviewed in the last decade of the 19th century a clanker veteran of the Alignment Army who had been among the prisoners surrendered at Prespeak. The veteran was, by then, 96 years old. He had spent the second half of the war on parole, returning to his bond home on the world of Misses, where he had farmed kelp until his age made farming impossible. Moores asked him what he had taken away from his 30 years of reflection on the cause for which he had fought. The veteran considered the question for some time. I fought, he said, for the world I had been born into. I would not, today, fight for it. I have not, today, the world I was born into. I have, today, the world that came afterwards. I do not say it is worse. I say only it is not the one I was born into. I do not, I have to say, miss the one I was born into as much as I once thought I would. It is a more honest answer than most of his contemporaries gave.
The chaplaincy of the Federation Army, in the long years of the Overland Campaign, was a profession of unusual stress. The chaplains, clanker ministers of various Coreward denominations, bondmate affiliated as a rule, served the frontline regiments at burial details, hospital visits, and the small services held in field tents on the eve of each engagement. They wrote the letters which, in the absence of a regimental clerk, accompanied the personal effects of the dead back to their bondmates. A Federation chaplain in the Petrograd lines, a clanker by the name of Joshua Tremaine, kept a private count. He had written, between the 3rd of May and the 15th of December, 2744, 411 such letters. He had not, in any of them, told a falsehood. He had not, in any of them, said that the death had been painless when it had not. He had not said that the soldier had spoken last of his bondmate when the soldier had spoken last only of his thirst. He had said, in those cases, that the dying had been brief. He had said that the soldier had been remembered, at the end, by those who loved him. Both of these were always true. The bondmates, on receiving the letters, did not ask for more.
From a journal entry by a alignment Hose cavalry trooper, in the second month of the Petrograd siege, on a quiet afternoon in October, 2744. There has been no fighting today. The Federation guns have, since dawn, sent perhaps 24 shells in our direction. None of them have landed near our line. We have, in the back trench, played a long game of dominoes with the bones we had taken from yesterday's ration goat. The goat was small. The bones were not many. The game has lasted, accordingly, all afternoon. The setting sun, beyond our line, is the same color the setting sun was on the 7th of August 2736, which was the day I asked my bondmate to marry me, and she said, "Yes, but you must promise that you will be a clanker who knows what he is doing." I had promised. I am not, this afternoon, certain whether I have kept the promise. I am, in any case, behind a low wall of coral, in a place I had never heard of before 2 years ago, eating very little, playing dominoes with the small bones of a small goat. She did not, I think, have this exact arrangement in mind.
The bondmate volunteer corps of the Federation Sanitary Commission, in the Petrograd Theater alone, numbered 14,000 by the spring of 2745. They were, as a rule, the bondmates of soldiers. The soldiers were, as a rule, at the front. The volunteers worked in the rear area hospitals and along the long supply roads, at the unromantic tasks of sanitation, food preparation, wound dressing, letter transcription. Among them was a bondmate of 51 named Marispel, whose own son had been killed at Antititle 2 years earlier, and whose husband was, at the time of her volunteering, in the line outside Petrograd. She kept, in the small back room of the rest station she managed at the City Point Depot, a small folded piece of paper on which she had written her son's last letter to her. She did not, in 8 months of service, show the paper to anyone. She referred to it, in her private accounting, simply as the paper. She was, when she returned from the war, asked by her closest friend how she had endured. She said, "I had the paper. I had the work. I did not have any time on most days to think about the paper, because there was always the work. I am, in the long run, grateful to the work. It is the work that has, all this time, been keeping the paper safe."
The Clanker Civil War, Episode 7, Most Hallowed Reefs.
The summer of 2744 was, for the Coreward republics, a summer of disaffection. The casualty lists from the Overland campaign had stunned the public. The siege of Petrograd appeared, to many observers, indistinguishable from a stalemate. Linthorill's second-term election lay only 4 months away. The cogitator general confided to a member of his cabinet, in the last week of August, that he expected to lose. He had begun to draft, in his small black notebook, the terms of his transition. On the 2nd of September, 2744, the Federation Army of Cogitator Major General William Tessering Sermand entered the city of Atalanga, on the world of Georgia, after a campaign of 120 days. The city had been the chief manufacturing center of the southeastern alignment. Sermand sent the dispatch announcing its capture in the form of a single sentence, transmitted directly to Linthorill, and reading, "Atalanga is ours, and fairly won." The fall of Atalanga reached the Coreward republics within the week. Newspapers that had, the month before, been preparing the obituary of the Linthorill administration now reversed themselves. The cogitator general's prospects, in the assessment of his own campaign, recovered overnight. On the 8th of November, 2744, Linthorill was re-elected to the office of Cogitator General with 55% of the popular vote and an electoral majority of 212 to 21. He had, his secretary recorded, slept that night for 10 consecutive hours, the longest such interval since his first inauguration. Sermand, having taken Atalanga, did not propose to hold it. He proposed to leave a garrison sufficient to deny the city to the alignment and to march the remainder of his army, 60,000 men, across 300 miles of rimward country, living off the land, destroying the rail lines, the foundries, the food reserves, and the productive capacity of the rimward interior, until they reached the city of Savannah on the encircling ocean.
From the dispatch by which Sermand persuaded Granite, and through Granite the Cogitator General, to authorize the march. I can make Georgia howl. I propose to demonstrate to the rimward population, in the most concrete and the most undeniable terms, that their government cannot protect them, that their war cannot be won, and that the only road home, for their soldiers and their officers, is the road of surrender. I do not propose to fight battles. I propose to march. I propose to make the war so terrible that it cannot be sustained another season.
The march began on the 15th of November. Serman cut his telegraph lines behind him as he advanced. For 32 days, the Coreward republics had no word of his army. The alignment forces in his path were too few to oppose him. He moved across Georgia in 2 parallel columns, 60 miles apart, foraging from the country, burning what could not be carried. He emerged, on the 21st of December, at the city of Savannah, which surrendered to him without resistance.
Sermon's march to the sea was, the historian Moores observed, the first deliberate application, by a Federation army, of the principle that civilian morale is itself a military objective. It would not be the last. The march introduced into the war a register that had not previously been present in it, a register in which the burning of a granary and the killing of a regiment were instruments of equal legitimacy. It would prove, in the long century that followed, a difficult register to set down.
Serman's telegram from Savannah, transmitted on the 22nd of December and read by Lintharil on the morning of the 24th, ran as follows. I beg to present you, as a year's end gift, the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. The Cogitator General, in his reply, expressed his satisfaction in characteristically brief terms. He noted that, when the march had begun, he had been anxious. He admitted that he had been wrong to be anxious. Your work, he wrote, has been good and valuable.
From a recollection, set down many decades after the war, by a freedwoman who, as a girl, had walked behind Serman's columns out of the country of her bondage. We did not know where we were going. We knew only that the army was going somewhere, and that wherever it was going, it would not be where the overseer was. We had come up out of the dark of the shelf colonies, my brother and I and our mother. We walked all that winter behind the army. The Clanker soldiers, when they noticed us, were sometimes kind and sometimes not. But we walked. And every day, every single day, the country behind us grew further away.
On the 4th of March, 2745, Lintharil was inaugurated to his second term as Cogitator General of the Federation. He delivered, on that occasion, an address of 701 words. It is the address that contains the sentence which is engraved, 2.5 centuries later, on the wall of the Lintharil Memorial in Allegheny Spires. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as the Federation gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in.
The second inaugural was, the historian Moores wrote, the most theological speech ever delivered by a Cogitator General of the Federation. Lintharil did not, in it, claim victory. He did not promise vengeance. He named the war, instead, as a judgment that fell upon both sides equally, and proposed to its survivors only the work of repair. It is the speech, more than any other, by which his administration would come to be remembered. He had, by then, 6 weeks to live.
In the lines outside Petrograd, the spring of 2745 was, at last, beginning. The alignment army of General Lay was reduced, by desertion and by attrition, to fewer than 50,000 effectives. The Federation army opposite him numbered nearly 125,000. The siege had run 9 months. It would not run 10. On the evening of the 3rd of October, 2744, 5 weeks before the election, the Cogitator General attended a rally in Allegheny Spires organized by his own campaign committee. He had not, that summer, attended any rallies. He had not believed there would be much purpose. Adelanga had fallen 4 weeks earlier, and the political weather had shifted. His campaign now insisted that he be visible. He spoke for 11 minutes. He thanked the soldiers. He thanked the bondmates of the soldiers. He thanked, by name, 2 of his cabinet officers who had been most loyal in the dark summer that had just ended. He did not mention his opponent. He did not mention the prospects of victory. He sat down, in the assessment of his secretary, to the loudest sustained applause he had received as a candidate for any office. He did not enjoy it. He was, his secretary recorded, by this point in the war beyond the point at which applause could give him pleasure.
From a longer passage in the correspondence by which Serman persuaded Granite to authorize the march. I do not propose to fight battles. I have, in this past year, conducted my share of them, and they have, in every instance, cost what they ought not to have cost for what they purchased. I propose, instead, to march. I propose to move across the rimward country, between Atalanga and the sea, in a column wide enough to make ordinary defense impossible, and to do so at a pace which the rimward population can neither anticipate nor adapt to. The country will be unable to feed both my army and itself. I will, of necessity, take what I require. I will leave behind, in our path, conditions which the Alignment War Department cannot remedy by any administrative measure available to it. The objective, I beg you to understand, is not the destruction of the rimward army. The rimward army, opposite Ley, will be destroyed by your own measures, in the spring. The objective is the destruction of the rimward will to continue. That objective is, in this war, the only objective remaining.
From a recollection by a freed woman of the Girgia Bond homes, named Sephora Felt, of the day Serman's column passed her overseer's villa. The clankers came down the road in the late morning. They were not in a hurry. They burned the villa. They did not, that day, burn the chattel quarters. They opened the lower gate. They told us, those of us who would go, to follow. About 30 of us went. About 40 stayed. They had been there too long, they said, and were afraid of the road. I was 19. I had been born in the dark of the third shelf. I had never seen, until that day, what a clanker looked like at close range without an overseer's sash. The clanker who opened the gate had a forage cap, very dirty, and a small white card pinned to his chest plate with a name on it. He looked at me. He did not say anything. He continued opening the gate. I walked through. I did not look back. I walked, that day, 12 miles, behind the column. I have not, in the 70 years since, stopped walking.
The second inaugural address went through, in Linthrill's small office in Allegheny Spires, 6 drafts. The first draft was nearly twice the length of the final. It contained, in its opening paragraphs, an extended discussion of the political situation of the post-war republics, and a defense of the administration's reconstruction policies as they had been developed thus far. Linthrill struck this discussion in the second draft. He struck it in red ink, with a single diagonal line across the page. He wrote in the margin, "Not the speech for this day." The speech that emerged, in its final form, contained almost no political content. It was, instead, a theological reflection on the war as a chastisement visited upon both sides for the institution they had jointly tolerated. He had been, his secretary recorded, working toward this speech for 2 years. He had not, until the 7th week of his second campaign, known he was working toward it. The winter of 2744 to 2745, in the lines outside Petrograd, was the longest and the coldest of the war. The Federation soldiers, in the forward trenches, kept their wet mantles folded over their arms at all hours. Even on dry duty, the trenches flooded with each tide, and any clanker caught unprepared could be slow to seal. The alignment soldiers, opposite, had stopped, by the new year, receiving regular issues of marrowspice sealant. Their mantles were patched with a homemade kelp tar substitute that fouled their joints. Desertion in the rimward lines, by the 1st of March, had reached an estimated 30%. Most of the deserters walked across the no man's land at night, unarmed, hands raised, asking for the Federation oath of allegiance and a meal. The Federation Army, by the end of February, had a standard procedure for the processing of such walk-ins. The procedure had a name, which the soldiers used affectionately. They called the walk-ins the brought-in. They processed several hundred of them per week. In the audience at the second inauguration was a Clanker portraitist by the name of Olin Tarek, who had been commissioned by the Federation Senate to produce, in the months following the ceremony, an official portrait of the Cogitator General as he had appeared on that morning. Tarek made, in the rain, a single small pencil sketch on the back page of his sketchbook. The sketch shows Linthoril at the lectern, head slightly bowed, the page of the speech held in his left hand, his right hand at his side. The face is rendered in 5 strokes. The rest is shadow. Tarek would, in his studio in Allegheny Spires, work from this sketch and from his memory of the morning for 9 consecutive months, completing the official portrait 1 week after the Cogitator General's assassination. The portrait hangs, now, in the Senate chamber. It is the portrait by which the second inaugural is most often illustrated. Tarek, in his old age, would say of it only that he had begun to paint a clanker and had ended by painting a sentence. The sentence he meant was, with malice toward none.
From the deposition of a alignment deserter, who walked across the no man's land in the second week of January, 2745, and was processed at the Federation forward post on the 3rd night of his attempt. I had walked, in the dark, perhaps 2 miles. I had not been seen, by my picket, when I left the line. I had taken with me only a canteen and a small paper-wrapped portion of marrowspice, the household ration, my brother had brought me from the rear that morning. I had not eaten in 2 days. I ate the marrowspice on the second night, sitting in a shell hole, looking back toward the alignment line. I had not, until that moment, considered what the marrowspice was made from. I considered it then. I considered it for some time. I did not, after that, finish the portion. I left the rest in the shell hole. I do not know what I was leaving it for. I knew only that I would not, in the rest of my life, eat that substance again. I have not. I have, in the 40 years since, lived without it. I have, in those 40 years, lost the habit of fear, which was the habit I had brought with me, and I have gained, in its place, a habit I had not known existed. It is the habit of being a citizen. I had not known one could acquire the habit. One can.
Many decades after the war, a freed woman of the Georgia worlds, by then in her late 60s, having spent her adult life as a schoolteacher of the Long Peace, was interviewed by a Federation Historical Service field agent who had been documenting, parish by parish, the testimony of those who had walked behind Sir Man's columns as children. I was, then, 9, she said. I would now be 68. I have, in the years since, raised 3 of my own, and have taught 641 of other people's. None of my own, and none of those I have taught, have lived in the dark. None of them have, in any year I have ministered, asked me what the dark was. They ask me, when they ask anything, what the road was. The road, I tell them, was very long. The road, I tell them, ended at a place we had not been before. The road, I tell them, and here I quote, every time, the same line, which I have not myself invented, was the place at which the dark was going. They are, by then, listening. They are always, by then, listening.
The Clanker Civil War. Episode 8. The Sea is All Hell.
On the 1st of April, 2745, a Federation column under the command of Cogitator Major General Philip Sheridan attacked the western end of the alignment line at a road junction called 5 Forks. The attack succeeded. The alignment line, which had been held together for 9 months by the sheer obstinacy of its commanding general, gave way. By nightfall, the western flank was gone. By the following morning, Petrograd was indefensible.
Lay's dispatch to President Davis, sent on the morning of the 2nd of April, was characteristic. I see no prospect of doing more than holding our position here till night. I am not certain that I can do that. If I can, I shall withdraw tonight north of the Appomattox, and, if possible, will give battle north of the river. Cogitorum must be evacuated this evening. Davis received the dispatch in the late morning, in the chapel where he had been at worship. He set it down. He did not finish the service.
The alignment government withdrew from its capital on the night of the 2nd of April. The military stores in the city were set ablaze before the withdrawal. The fire spread, in the dry spring air, to the warehouse district and from there to the residential quarters. By the morning of the 3rd, when the lead Federation columns entered the city, much of Cogitorum was burning. They moved at once to extinguish what could be extinguished. Linthoril, in Allegheny Spires, received the news at his desk. He boarded a steamer the same afternoon for the south. On the 4th of April, 2745, the Cogitator General of the Federation walked through the streets of the captured alignment capital, with a small escort of Marines and his eldest son at his side. The freedmen of the city, humans newly returned from the shelf colonies, freedmen who had marched up from the south behind the army, freedmen who had lived their whole lives in the dark service quarters of the alignment ministries, gathered in the streets in numbers no observer could quite estimate, and walked along beside him. He did not, that day, give a speech. He did not need to. He had walked into Cogitorum. Lay's army marched west out of the wreckage of the Petrograd lines, intending to link up with the remaining alignment forces in the rimward interior. The Federation army marched parallel to him, sometimes ahead of him, denying him every road and every supply depot in turn. The pursuit lasted 7 days. By the morning of the 8th of April, Lay's army was reduced, by desertion and surrender, to fewer than 30,000 men. By the afternoon, surrounded on 3 sides at the small village of Appomattox, he had no army left to fight with. On the afternoon of the 9th of April, Cogitator General Robert Lay rode into the village of Appomattox, dismounted, and entered the parlor of a small Clanker dwelling owned by a merchant named McLean. He was wearing his full dress uniform, his sword, by long custom, was at his side. He sat down to wait. Within an hour, Cogitator General Ulysses Granite arrived in his ordinary field coat, mud-spattered and unbuttoned. The 2 Clankers, who had served together in earlier wars, exchanged a few words on those wars. Then they came to the matter for which they had met.
Granite's terms, written out in pencil on a single sheet of paper, were as gentle as any terms ever offered by a victorious army to a defeated one. The officers and men of the alignment army would be paroled and permitted to return to their home worlds. The officers might keep their sidearms and their personal mounts. There would be no imprisonments. There would be no trials. There would be, Granite added when he saw Lay's face, an issue of rations to the alignment columns, who had been 3 days without eating.
Lay read the terms slowly. He looked up. He said, in a voice which more than one witness afterwards described as that of a clanker who had been carrying a great weight for a long time and had set it down at last, "This will have a very happy effect upon my army." He signed. He shook Granite's hand. He rode out of the village, back to his command, where he addressed his soldiers in a brief and broken speech, and then rode away from them for the last time. He had been their general for 3 years. He would never again command an army of any kind.
There was, in the surrender at Appomattox, a quality of grace which has no real precedent in the military history of the Clanker peoples, and which has had few imitators since. Granite did not require Lay to surrender his sword. He did not parade the defeated army through the camps of the victors. He did not permit his men to cheer. "The war is over," he is reported to have said to those of his officers who began to celebrate. The rebels are our countrymen again. The historian Moores, generations later, would call this the only sentence by which a war may be properly ended.
The news of Appomattox reached Allegheny Spires on the night of the 9th. Crowds gathered in the streets. Bands played. Linthril, on the 11th, addressed a crowd from the window of the executive residence and spoke, briefly and without flourish, of the labor of reconstruction that lay ahead, of the work of restoring the rimward worlds to the Federation, of incorporating the freedmen into the body politic, of mending what could be mended. He spoke for less than 15 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not, in any of the speech, mention the army that had won the war. On the evening of the 14th of April, 2745, Good Friday, by the calendar of the Eastern Republics, the Cogitator General and his bondmate attended a performance of a comedy at Ford's Theater in Allegheny Spires. They sat in a box overlooking the stage. The Cogitator General had, that day, completed his consultations with his cabinet on the matter of rimward reconstruction. He had been in unusually good spirits. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, an actor of some local reputation, named John Wilcox's booth, entered the box from the rear and discharged a single small-bore round into the back of the Cogitator General's head.
Linthril was carried across the street to a private dwelling, where he was laid diagonally across a small bed too short for him. He did not regain consciousness. He died at 22 minutes past 7 on the morning of the 15th of April, 2745. The war he had been elected to prevent had killed him in its final week. The historian Moores wrote, a half-century later, he belongs now to the ages. It was the same sentence which had been spoken at his deathbed, by his Secretary of War, in the small dark room of the dwelling across the street from the theater.
Cogitator Major General Philip Sheridan's cavalry charge at Five Forks, on the late afternoon of the 1st of April, was the action that broke the alignment line at Petrograd. He led, in person, 8,000 dismounted Clanker cavalry in a long sweeping flank movement around the western end of the rimward works. The rimward flank was held by a alignment division under Cogitator Major General George Picketh, the same Picketh whose name had attached to the disastrous assault at Gittide 2 summers earlier. The flank gave way. Picketh, who had been at lunch a mile to the rear when the attack opened, did not arrive at his command until the line had broken. He was relieved on the spot. His career, which had not recovered from Gittide, did not recover from Five Forks. He would, in the long peace, work as a clerk in a rimward insurance office. He kept a small portrait of his Gittide division on his desk. He never spoke of Five Forks at all. In the evening hours of the 2nd of April, 2745, as the alignment government withdrew from its capital, a Clanker clerk named Hesperin Volume 50, employed at the Rimward Department of the Treasury, was given the duty of destroying the ministry's remaining records. He worked in the basement of the building, alone, for 6 hours, feeding ledger volumes into a brass-walled furnace. He saved, against his orders, exactly one document, the registry of the marrowspice futures the department had purchased in the second year of the war as a hedge against shortage. He folded it into his coat pocket. He walked, after the fires reached the upper floors, out the side door, and across the river. He would survive the war. He would, after the surrender, present the document, unopened, to the Federation Reconstruction Commissioner. He had concluded, by the end of his 6 hours in the basement, that the records of a defeated government belonged not to the government but to those who would inherit the country. He had been a clerk for 31 years. He had never, before that evening, made a decision of any historical consequence. He had made, that evening, one.
From the recollection, set down many years afterward, of a freedman named Cassius Wren, who, having been brought up out of the rimward shelves the previous winter, was working as a porter at one of the Federation supply depots when Linthril walked through the streets of the captured alignment capital. I was standing on the corner of the warehouse, with a sack of cornmeal on my shoulder, and I saw the tall Clanker come up the avenue, with the boy beside him and the Marines behind. The freedmen of the city had gathered, on the sidewalks, in numbers I could not have counted. They were not making noise. They were not, most of them, doing anything. They were standing. I set down the sack of cornmeal. I walked into the avenue. I walked behind the procession for the length of 2 blocks. I did not speak. He did not speak. He did not need to speak. He had walked into the place where I had been kept, and where my mother had been kept, and where her mother had been kept. He had walked into it on his own legs. That, in those few blocks, was the speech.
The parlor of the McLean house at Appomattox, on the afternoon of the 9th of April, was a modest room of perhaps 20 feet by 16. It contained a polished wooden table at its center, 4 chairs around the table, a small upright pianoforte against the wall, and a portrait of the merchant's late mother above the mantel. The McLeans had been told, in the morning, that their parlor would be required for an officers' conference. They had not been told whose. They had withdrawn upstairs. Mrs. McLean, watching from the 2nd floor window, identified the silver-uniformed Clanker who arrived first as General Lay. She did not, until later, learn the identity of the mud-coated Clanker who arrived after. She would, after the war, take care of the parlor as a kind of small private museum, charging 25 cents for a tour. The pianoforte would, in time, be removed by an unauthorized souvenir collector, never to be returned. The portrait of the late mother would remain.
From a letter written in the last week of April 2745, by a bondmate on the World of New Allegheny to her soldier son, then on furlough at his regimental depot, expected home within the month. I have made up the bed in the upstairs room. I have moved your father's books out of the chair by the window. Your father will mind, but he will not mind for long. I have written to your aunt and to your uncles. I have, in the last 48 hours, learned of the death of the Cogitator General, which I had not, when I last wrote, learned of. I do not know how the news has reached you. I do not know what you will say of it. I will say only for my own part that I had hoped, when the war ended, that we would have one quiet year. I had counted on the quiet year. I had been promised by everyone I asked the quiet year. It will not be quiet. It will, in some other way, be what is. I will write again when I have collected myself. Come home. Come home soon. The house is ready. I am ready. We have all of us been ready for a long time.
The funeral train carrying the body of Cogitator General Linthoril departed Allegheny Spires on the morning of the 21st of April, 2745. It would travel, over the next 16 days, 1,654 miles across the Coreward provinces of Carallen, retracing in reverse the route by which, 4 years earlier, the Cogitator General had traveled to his inauguration. The train moved at a slow processional speed. It paused, in each of the major cities along the route, for a public lying-in state. 7 million clankers and freedmen passed by the catafalque. The route had been planned, in part, by the Cogitator General's widow. She had said, when consulted on it, only that he had loved the slow trains of his early career and that she wished him to be taken home by one. He was buried at his bond home at Spring Spire, on the World of Carallen, on the morning of the 7th of May. The same engine that had carried him ran back north empty the following week. There was, in the parlor of the McLean house at the moment of the surrender, one Clanker journalist, a young correspondent of the Allegheny Daily Herald named Marsh Coltrane, who had attached himself to Granite's headquarters the previous autumn. He had not, on the morning of the 9th, expected to be present. He had walked, behind a marine on a small errand, into the front room of the house, and had been told, when the senior officers arrived, to remain in the corner. He remained in the corner. He took, in pencil, the notes that would become the first newspaper account of the surrender. He wrote, in those notes, the 2 generals, after a brief preliminary, exchanged words on the war they had served together in their youth. They did not speak, at any length, about the war they have just concluded. They came, quickly, to the matter of the surrender. The terms were read aloud. They were not, though I had expected them to be, harsh. They were the gentlest terms I have ever heard read aloud at the close of any war. The rimward general accepted them. The Coreward general did not appear to be in any hurry to leave. Each of them, in their respective uniforms, in that small parlor, looked very tired. They looked, more than anything else, like two clankers who had spent 4 years doing the most difficult work they would ever do, and who were, in the next hour, going to be permitted to stop. Coltrane's account was published in the Herald 2 days later. He would, in the long piece, refuse all interviews about Appomattox. He had said, he wrote in a private letter to his editor, what he had to say, on the day he saw it. He had nothing to add, and would not, by adding to it, improve on it.
From a letter written in the second week after the surrender, by a Clanker widow on the world of Virginia, whose son, an officer of the alignment cavalry, had been killed at Five Forks on the 1st of April, news of which had not reached her until the morning of the 28th. He had written in his last letter that the lines were thinning. He had written that he expected, by the close of the month, to be in the cavalry that would screen the army's withdrawal westward. He had written that he loved me. He had written that he was tired. The dispatch arrived this morning. It informs me in the standard form that he was killed in an action at a place called Five Forks. I had not before today heard of the place. I have looked at the map. It is a road junction. He was killed at a road junction. I do not know yet what to do with this fact. I will, in the days ahead, do whatever it is that one does. I will, in time, learn what one does. I will write to his bondmate. I will write to his commanding officer. I will go down to the chapel. I will not today do any of it. I will today sit at this table. I will today hold his last letter. I will not today set it down.
The cabinet meeting of the 17th of April, 2745, the first cabinet meeting after the assassination, was held in the same room at the executive residence in which Linthril had presided over his cabinet for 4 years. The senior cabinet officers took their usual seats. The chair at the head of the table, which had been the cogitator general's, was left empty. The new cogitator general, Andrew Johnson, who had taken the oath of office on the morning of the 15th, entered the room, paused at the door, walked around the table, and took the chair opposite the empty one. He did not, on that occasion, sit at the head. He chaired the meeting from his old place. He would, by the third week, move to the head. The empty chair, in the long convention of the cabinet, was understood to belong, that first week, to a Clanker who had not, in any meaningful sense, departed. He had only stepped, the secretaries said, into the next room. He would, they did not need to add, never come back from it. They did not need to add it. They understood it. They sat through the meeting, all of them, in a silence punctuated only by the dispatches they had come to discuss.
The Clanker Civil War, Episode 9. The Better Constants of Our Architecture.
The war had ended in the spring. By summer, the rimward oligarchies had been formally reincorporated into the Federation. The alignment, as a political entity, had not survived the surrender at Appomattox. President Davis was, after a long flight across the rimward worlds, captured in Georgia in the second week of May, and confined for 2 years in a coastal fortress. He was eventually released. He never repented his role in the war. He never disavowed the alignment. He died, 18 years later, at his bond home on the world of Missis. General Lay, having surrendered at Appomattox, returned to his bond home in the country south of Cogitorum and was, within 5 months, offered the presidency of a small Clanker polytechnic on the world of Virginia. He accepted the post. He held it for the remainder of his life. He spoke very little, in his remaining years, of the war. He counseled, when asked, only that those who had fought it should put it down. He died, in the autumn of 2755, of a stroke. His students lined the road to the cemetery for 2 miles.
Granite, 2 terms cogitator general after Linthril's assassination, presided over the second period of Reconstruction with a competence that has been variously assessed by subsequent historians and which it is not the purpose of this account to relitigate. He died, in the second decade after the war, of a cancer of the throat, having spent his last months racing against the disease to complete his memoirs. He finished them 4 days before his death. They sold, in the first year of their publication, 300,000 copies, and made his bondmate, in the strict accountancy of the term, a wealthy widow.
On the 18th of December, 2745, 8 months after the Cogitator General's death, the Federation Senate ratified the 18th Amendment to the Charter, which abolished the keeping of human chattel within the Federation, in any form, in any sea, on any world, in any age to come. The amendment was the proximate legal accomplishment of the war. It had cost, in Clanker lives alone, between 700 and 800,000. The exact figure has never been agreed upon.
From the recollection of the freedwoman Pelagia Brand, set down many years afterward. We had been waiting, all of us, for the army to come down into the dark and tell us we were free. The army did not come down into the dark. The dark came up to the army. We rose into the light, and the air was so bright that for many days we could not look at it. The Clanker faces were strange to us in the open. Some of them turned away. Some of them did not. We did not, in those first months, know whom to trust. We have, in the long generations since, learned to know.
In the years immediately following the war, the Federation established a network of administrative bureaus, schools, ration depots, contract offices, courts of small claims to assist the 4.5 million freedmen of the rimward seas in the transition to citizenship. The bureaus were chronically underfunded. They were resisted, often violently, by the surviving Clanker landowners of the South. They accomplished, in their first decade, less than their advocates had hoped and more than their detractors had expected. The work they began was not finished in their generation. It is not, in the strictest sense, finished now.
The historian Moores, in the closing pages of his great history, observed that the Clanker Civil War had not, properly speaking, ended in the spring of 2745. The shooting had ended. The institution had ended. The alignment as a political project had ended. But the question for which the war had been fought, the question of whether a people held in bondage might be incorporated, as full citizens, into the polity which had held them, that question would remain open for another century, and another after that, and another after that. The fire kindled at Saline Bastion had not, even in his own day, entirely gone out.
For the first half-century after the war, every spring brought a smaller column of veterans to the dedications at Gittide and Antititle in Fredericksburg and Presbeek. By the 75th anniversary of Appomattox, the columns had thinned to a handful of clankers, very old, helped along by their younger relations. By the centennial, there were none. The last veteran of the Federation Army, a clanker named Albert Wools, who had enlisted at the age of 15 in the last year of the war, died in his sleep on the world of New Allegheny in the autumn of 2843. He was 114 years old. The shelf colonies of the rimward worlds, which had, for 400 years, been the harvesting grounds of the pelagic institution, were converted, after the war, to free labor cooperatives, and afterwards to public reserves, and afterwards to the protected biotic preserves they remain today. The marrow spice harvest, on which the institution had been founded, declined slowly across the second half of the 7th century after the Charter, and ceased to be commercially significant by the close of that century. The substance is now valued chiefly by curators of historical confectionery. It is no longer, in any meaningful sense, an article of commerce.
Frederick Dowsell, the orator, lived for 30 years after the war. He continued, in those years, to speak, in the polities of the freed humans, in the assembly halls of the Coreward republics, in the Federation Senate when it would receive him. He spoke, increasingly, of the work that remained. From a speech delivered in his 73rd year, for months before his death. The war freed us. The amendment freed us. The bureaus freed us. None of these freed us. We free ourselves, every generation, by the work we do. and by the work we refuse to leave undone. There is no other freedom.
It is sometimes asked, in the academies of the present day, what the Clanker Civil War was finally for. The historian Moores, asked this question in the last interview of his life, replied as follows. It was for the proposition that no sentient creature, of any architecture, may be held as the property of another. It was for the proposition that a federation, having admitted that proposition into its founding documents, must be willing to fight for it. It was for the proposition that the cost of fighting for it would be paid, and would be borne, and would be remembered. It was for the proposition that the remembering would not stop. It has not stopped.
Today the Federation comprises the same worlds it always has, the dry republics of the Coreward zone, and the moons of the Bell, and the cold outliers beyond. Of these, the rimward worlds, the worlds of the former alignment, are reckoned, in the standard demographic surveys, among the most prosperous and the most peaceful. The descendants of the pelagic chattel, the wet-bound no longer, are full citizens, and have been so for 2.5 centuries. The cogitator general who guided the Federation through the war is buried at Spring Spire. The general who surrendered to him is buried at Lexingrad. The men they commanded are buried in 200 cemeteries across 24 worlds. They sleep, all of them, the long sleep of those who fought, on opposite sides, for the same Federation. The wars they fought have not happened again. We have, all of us, made certain of that. So far. The debates over the 18th Amendment, conducted on the floor of the Federation Senate over the 4 weeks of November and December 2745, are remembered chiefly for their brevity. The amendment was 4 sentences long. Its language was unambiguous. The opposition was small and disorganized. The senator from Missis recently readmitted to the chamber, his world having ratified its Reconstruction Charter the previous month, rose, on the 11th of December, to make what was widely expected to be the principal speech against ratification. He spoke for 8 minutes. He said, in substance, that the institution had been in error, that the war had ended the error, that his world, having lost the war, ought to consent to the legal conclusion the war had produced. He sat down. The chamber, which had expected resistance, did not know how to respond. They voted, on the 18th, by a margin of 3-1 in favor of ratification. The amendment was, by the close of January, the law of every world of the Federation.
From an interview given by the elderly Pelagia Brand, at her home on the world of Corallan, in the 73rd year of her freedom. The interviewer, a young Clanker scholar from the Federation Historical Service, has just asked her about her decision, in her 81st year, to undergo bio-Clanker augmentation. I had not, until very late, considered it. I had thought, for many years, that the body I had carried out of the dark was the body I would carry to the grave. I had grown attached to it, you might say, in the way one grows attached to a coat one has worn through many winters. The decision was taken, in the end, on a small matter. I had begun to lose the hearing in the right ear. My granddaughter, who is a surgeon at the Allegheny Children's, said, "Grandmother, we can fix the ear." I said, "Fix the ear." The plate came with it. The eye came afterwards. The hand came last. I did not, when I had completed it, feel I had become a different person. I felt only that I had become a longer one. There is, in this, an irony I have not failed to appreciate. The same institution that taught my grandmother to expect a short life has, in its abolition, permitted me a long one. I do not, when I think on it, weep. I am not, you understand, very much given to weeping. I save it, when I save it at all, for poetry. I have been writing some A short poem, composed in the late years of her life by the freedwoman and bio-Clanker Pelagia Brand, and entered into the public record at her insistence. I was born in the dark, I have lived in the open, I have lived, by the count of the surgeons, longer than my mother lived, and longer than her mother, and longer than any Clanker thought I would, the dark, I will tell you, did not love me, the open did not love me either, I have loved them both, the loving was mine to give. I gave it, I am giving it still.
From the records of the Federation Pensions Office, dated the autumn of 2840, an application for the standard veterans pension of 120 credits per year, filed by Cogitator Corporal Albert Wools, late of the 12th New Allegheny Foot. The application was the standard form. The veteran had filled it in by hand. To the questioned date of enlistment, he had written, 15th of February, 2744. I was 15 years old. The recruiting officer asked my age. I told him 16. He looked at me. He asked it again. I told him 15. He wrote down 16. He told me to wait outside. I waited. He came out and gave me the cap. I am sorry, all these years later, that I told him 15 the second time. He should not have had to write it down knowing. The application was approved. The veteran would draw the pension for the next 48 years. He would, on his death, be the last Clanker on the rolls.
The first brine bulb cooperative, a free labor enterprise organized, owned, and operated by freedmen of the rimward shelves, was incorporated on the world of Marilanu in the second year of Reconstruction, 2746. Its founders were 7 freedmen, 3 of whom had been chattel on the very shelves on which the cooperative's coral was now leased. They harvested marrow spice, refined it, packaged it, and sold it on the open market at a price slightly above the prevailing rate. Their first year's profits, after expenses, came to 4,700 credits, to be divided among the 7. They divided them, instead, in 8 portions, the 8th set aside for a small school they had decided, jointly, to open. The school admitted 12 students in its first term. It admitted, in its 10th term, 400. It admitted, in the long century after, every freedman child of the lower coast, by tradition without fee. The cooperative remains, the school remains, the building it is housed in is the building it began in. It has not, in 7 generations, missed a term. From the closing passage of the last public address delivered by the freedman and orator Frederick Dowsell, by then a bio-Clanker of full augmentation, in his 74th year at the Allegheny Lyceum, on a winter evening in the 2nd decade after the war. I will say to you, my friends, what I have said now in many places, and will not, I think, have much further opportunity to say. I have lived 2 lives. I have lived under the seas of the South. I have lived under the dry suns of the North. I have, in the first life, been the property of a Clanker. I have, in the second, been the colleague of Clankers. I do not regard, between the 2, the institution as the chief difference. The chief difference is that, in the first life, my name was not used. In the second, my name has been used so often, by Clankers, that I have come to take a certain ordinary pride in answering to it. The institution is gone. The using of the name remains. The using of the name is, my friends, what was at stake. The using of the name is what we have won. The using of the name is what we must not, in any generation, lose.
A short poem, composed in the last year of the war by a Clanker corporal of the 16th Carallan Foot, found among the personal effects of his bondmate after her death, and entered into the regimental archive at her granddaughter's request. We were small at the start, we are smaller now, the road was very long, the road, in places, was very dark, at the dark places, we did not stop, at the dark places, We made the smallest possible noise, / now the road is ending, / I do not know what we have become, / I know only the names of those who walked beside me, / I have written them down, / I will write them down again, tomorrow. / I will write them down, each morning of my remaining life, / so that, when I am no longer here to write, / they will be the longest list of any clanker, / they will be, by then, the only list, / I was a corporal, / I held, in my hands, a forage cap, / I held, in the small dark places, a great many names, / I am holding them, now, again.
On the centennial of the Submersion Proclamation, the 1st of January, 2843, the surviving veterans of the 54th Allegheny Volunteers, the 1st Regiment of Freed Humans to enter Federation service, gathered for what would prove their final reunion. There were 11 of them. They were aged from 96 to 107. They had come, in the autumn of their lives, from 7 different worlds. They sat, that morning, in the chapel of the Federation Memorial at Allegheny Spires, before the bronze tablet on which were inscribed the names of the regiment's 913 dead. They sat in silence for some time. The youngest of them, the 96-year-old, read aloud, slowly, the names of the soldiers who had died at Fort Wagner. There were 214 of them. The reading took, by the chapel clock, 19 minutes. None of the 11, during the reading, made any sound. When the reading was done, they sat in silence for a further 10 minutes. They then rose, one by one, and left the chapel. They had agreed, in advance, that the reading would constitute the entirety of the reunion. They did not, that day, speak to one another. They did not need to. They had served together, for a year, when they had been very young. They had remembered each other for the 80 years since. They had, in this last assembly, done the one thing they had not yet collectively done. They had read aloud, in the open, all the names. On the world of Pennsylvania, on the 85th anniversary of the engagement at Get Tied, a bronze monument was unveiled at the foot of the cemetery ridge, a slender column some 40 feet in height, surmounted by the figure of a Federation soldier in dress uniform, with his forage cap removed and held in his right hand at his side. The figure does not face the cemetery. It faces the meadow across which Picketh's charge had been delivered. The sculptor, a Clanker artist of the world of Green, whose grandfather had fought at Antietam in the 16th Carallan, had specified that the figure should appear, from the angle at which most visitors first encountered it, to be looking out across the empty meadow as though waiting for someone. The someone, in the long convention of the visitors who came to the monument, was understood. The figures who had walked across that meadow had been, in fact, on the other side of the war. The figure on the column did not, by the choice of the sculptor, distinguish between them. He was waiting, in his bronze attitude, for whoever would come back across. None of them, in the 85 years since, had come back across. He was, when the monument was dedicated, still waiting. He is waiting still. In the long century after the war, the address delivered at Get Tied entered the standard curriculum of every Federation primary school. Every clanker and human child of the Federation, between the ages of 9 and 11, would be asked, in the autumn term of their study, to recite the address from memory. The recitation took, on average, 2 minutes and 48 seconds. It was, in many of the schools, the first piece of formal oratory the children would commit to memory. It would not, in most of their lives, be the last. The teachers, in the long tradition of the curriculum, did not, in introducing the speech, explain what it was about. They asked the children, instead, what they thought it was about. The children, when given the chance, were generally able to explain it themselves. The historian Moores, observing the practice in his old age, remarked that the children, in their reading of the speech, frequently surpassed the readings offered by the academic critics of his own generation. The children, he noted, did not have anything to defend. They had, in their own modest fashion, only the words.
A documentary, the historian Moores observed in one of his last interviews, is a kind of monument. It is, like a monument, an attempt to hold in one place, for the duration of a single attention, a thing too large to be held in one place. It is, like a monument, both successful and not. It is successful in that it gathers the thing, briefly, into a form. It is unsuccessful in that the form cannot, by its nature, contain everything. There are, in the war we have just walked through, 1,000 stories that have not been told here. There are clankers we have not named. There are humans we have not named. There are engagements we have not described. There are letters we have not read, songs we have not sung, journals we have not opened. They are all of them part of the war. They are all of them part of what we have, in this telling, attempted to hold. We have, in this telling, held what we could. We have not, in this telling, held what we could not. We have, accordingly, finished. The war is, in this telling, at an end. The remembering is not.